Get it on your fingers spot first and then it's
All right, welcome to the April-May Governance Group meeting. We're going to go ahead and get this meeting started with a roll call. If you each would say your name and organization. Start with you here, Lou.
Lou Tortora, YVHA Board.
Emily Fassman, Yampa Valley Housing Authority. And Helga Salinas, Route County Commissioner.
Shannon Landers, YVHA Board.
Dave Barton, City Council.
Reason, City of People Springs.
And once again, I'm Gail McMonigal.
Radio.
Gail's.
Oh, yep. Gail, will you give us your online roll call? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Gail Gary, Steamboat Springs City Council.
And in just one moment, we will also be joined by Jay Harrington from Route County. And I'm Gail McMonigal with Civic Canopy. I'm facilitating this meeting. I'm joined by my colleague Daniela Young, who will be helping with technology. So for anyone who's online, if you're having any issues accessing something, go ahead and message Daniela and or Brad with the City of Steamboat, and they can help you out. Just for any online participants, know that this is a working meeting. And so we won't have necessarily space for open comment. You have one participant in the meeting who's online who will speak, but otherwise you're invited to simply observe the meeting. And then lastly, Clark, will you introduce yourself?
helping with both technical content as well as facilitation.
Okay, so here's what we've got on the docket for today. Overall, this is one meeting in a series of meetings with the intent to build a collaborative effort to define the next decision-making steps for the Slate Creek neighborhood, formerly known as Brown Ranch. So during this period, we're just kind of determining what the collaboration looks like and how the group is going to make decisions. What we're going to focus on today, as always, one of our objectives is improving our ability to collaborate across all these different entities. But then the things that we are working to get done over the course of today and tomorrow is we'll review some recommendations from comms teams at the county, YVHA, and city on a group name and hopefully come to a consensus decision on that. Then last time we started brainstorming the key milestones and timelines. We'd like to revise those and fully flesh those out this meeting. And then also finalize the end state this group is working towards. Then one piece after we met last time, we had combined a brainstorm about community engagement overall. After talking with the comms teams, they want to separate out what's our communications approach and what's a community engagement approach. So we'll do a deeper dive on that, hand over our advice to those comms teams, and they'll bring us back a menu of options for our next meeting. Okay, any questions or thoughts about what we're accomplishing today? All right. Okay, so just this was our initial, apologies. Let me mute the noise from folks. Okay. So this was the initial timeline we had set out with. I remember an early meeting actually with Jay where he said, that's ambitious to get it all. And scheduling has been kind of the thing that's stopped us from being exactly on time. But as we've gone through it, we've worked to establish this group. As of the last meeting, we kept finalizing. YVHA has some different representation in this group to finalize who's a part of this governance group. We've been starting on the brainstorming for the planning process. Now we're in the place where we're ready to start finalizing the planning process and get into revising and adopting the plan so that we can start actually acting on them. So here's another version of this, which is just kind of our adjusted timeline with the ways that things have shaken out.
I don't think you're screen sharing right now. I know I can't see it and Gail can't see it.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, so here we are now in please. May, we are finalizing the planning process here in April and May. Then meeting in June and or depending on scheduling, what it looks like July. But there's one question I want to pose in here, depending on how things went in talking with your respective organizations about whether or not there is the need for a meeting of board, council, and commissioners to review all the plans, or if there's enough authority for this group to move this work forward independently. So that'll be one question I want to ask as we go into the conversation for today. So that's where we're at in the process. I know there's been moments where it's felt like we've kind of adjusted things as we've gone, but I wanted to show you this to show that overall we're pretty darn on track. We're just kind of maybe a month off. All right, so as we get started, I'm going to just have us first, I know we did a roll call, but I'm going to have us do a little icebreaker introduction because we have some new folks in the group this time. And I'm going to have you answer this kind of icebreaker question, which is, are you a slow cooker, an oven, or a microwave? So a microwave is somebody who has ideas right away. They jump into the conversation. Whereas a slow cooker is the person who's really quiet throughout a meeting and then brings in some really juicy stuff in the end, right? An oven somewhere in the middle. You're a good, even roast, right? And so I'll give an example of this. I am a big old introvert. So for a long time in my life, I was a slow cooker. But as I've had to take on different leadership roles, I think now I'm actually a microwave and I have to tell myself to like quiet down. Can I pick on you to go next?
My quiet down voice disappeared a long time ago. So I guess I'd be somewhere between a microwave and an oven.
Okay.
I'd like to think of myself as an oven.
Like to think of yourself, is there something that you might actually be?
No, I think I'm an oven.
Okay.
I think I'm an oven as well. But also maybe a pressure cooker, like not a slow cooker, but a pressure cooker where you could go fast or you could go. Don't want to wrench in there. Sorry.
You're all good. You like to get to the juicy bits, but you don't want to wait.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So pressure cooker, not slow cooker.
Okay.
Jay Harrington, Routt County. I'd say oven, but I'm gonna throw an air fryer too. Cause
Okay.
it's kind of like an acceleration of the cooking process.
Okay.
Kind of like Kale, but in reverse. I think I've always been a bit of a microwave, sometimes problematically so, because things can explode in the microwave. But over time, as I've been in different leadership roles, I've slowly gotten a little bit better at being an oven when I stay composed. So yeah.
I think I'm a slow cooker, but an aspiring oven.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
I'm definitely a thermonuclear.
So where's it?
You have to listen to what you said.
Sometimes.
Tom Reason, City of Steamboat. I'd say I'm more of a convection oven.
Okay. What
Not
makes
just a slow roasting oven, but holds a little bit like Jay's.
Power in
A
the
little accelerated.
so great. All right, nice. So now we have
Wait, what
this
about you?
Thank you.
and Gail, yes.
Can Gail speak?
Yes.
Yes, I can. It's Gail Gary, Spring City Council. I would say an oven, but I can have a tendency to be a microwave, depending on the issue. So maybe it's an Instapot.
I think this is the most additional appliances I've ever gotten to do this icebreaker. Awesome. All right, well, this gives us a little cue into how each of us shows up in the conversation, and then we can make room for some of our other appliances as need be, our aspiring ovens and things like that. So, okay. like usual, I'm gonna have us just touch base on these council and board working agreements and see if there are any that you think are going to be particularly important to us today. And or are there any that we need to give any SBIs around? Where we need to say, hey, there's something that happened in between last meeting and this meeting. And I just want to talk through the impact so I know we're still on board with all of these working agreements.
I think clear and respectful communication should be highlighted. Not because we didn't do it last time, but because since our last meeting, there's been, article in the pilot about the rebranding to the Slate Creek neighborhood, and there's been community members who have, for what it's worth, tracked it on social media and have been like, why are we doing this? A rebrand isn't gonna help. And, so like people are paying attention. And so just to highlight that, I think we are doing a good job of being open and clear. The promotion for this, anyone can sign on, but just the more we can keep that in the front of when I look at what it says, project communication needs to be effective for engagement to work with people to understand and track the work. I think that just still needs to be in the front. So I think we're doing that, but just to highlight that we have to keep.
Appreciate. And what I hear too is you're really pulling out like the transparency piece of this one.
I
With
think
the
so.
larger community.
I like transparency, but also just for the community to understand why this group exists. That it's not a rehashing of what we did before, that we are, we have these goals, we want to see progress when it comes to housing, when it comes to that parcel, that this is not a negotiation, we're like that, I think the community wants to understand what this group is and what it's doing, and hope we can communicate that to them.
And would it be worth drafting a statement after each one of these group meetings to then collaboratively put on all three websites, so the message is the same and uniform?
Okay. And we can add that to the list of, we'll, as like a set of consultants, meet with the comms folks after, I think next Friday, actually, so we can add that to the list of things to, I think now that the group's more fully formed, it feels like we're ready to really get on the same page of comms like that. Yeah.
Get on front of the newspaper and articulate the story the way we want it to be told.
Wasn't part of our discussion today. It's going to be community engagement.
It's gonna be tomorrow, but yes, it's gonna be, yep. Are you thinking about this encourage community involvement piece too?
Well, yeah, it's how we do that is really important.
Okay,
And I'm not sure how we can.
so that one's also gonna be front of mind as we come into this meeting. All right. Well, at any point, if there's a need to come back to the agreements, you can just say, hey, can we come back to the group agreements? But this feels like some important places to get started, just to place our focus for today. So now we'll jump into our first decision, which is the group name recommendations. And so, yes,
We have a new member here,
yes,
and I haven't really met you. I know your name's Shannon, but,
Yeah.
I'd love to learn a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh, that's all I know.
That's all you need. That's all.
That's it.
Yeah, exactly. I work as a care coordinator at the Health Partner Sector in Steamboat, which is a nonprofit. So we have offices in Crichton, Steamboat. So I work directly with clients to overcome barriers to healthcare access. So a lot of that is housing, food access, and like social work kind of stuff. And then I also work for Advocates of Routt County part-time. So I'm backup staff on the weekends. So their staff, like full-time staff, can have a break on the weekends. And I manage their 24/7 hotline. So it's a crisis hotline for folks that are experiencing any form of intimate partner violence and stuff like that. And yeah, I recently joined the board for YBHA in January, so a couple months in, but yeah, I'm excited to
Do the
make sure.
short stack together.
Exactly.
Yeah. Do you know everybody here and what the roles are? I mean, I know we said where we work, but
I do for the most part. I know almost everyone personally, I think, except for maybe, but yeah. I didn't.
You got it.
Yeah. Shay and Tom, I'm sorry.
You nailed it so far. If you're not gonna know any of them, that's great.
We're the two not.
You nailed it.
So,
It's gonna plug Shannon more. She was also part of the DST.
Yep.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so she has that experience of like going through the VST, the deliberation and stewardship team. She's lived in YBHA housing.
Would it be helpful to get a little bit of background from Tom and Jay as well?
That would be great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll start. I'm the city manager, been the city manager for a little over a year now and was deputy city manager before that. My background's all in land use planning, so I was planning director for Fort Collins for 7 years and then was actually planning director here before that in the 2000s. So,
Great, thanks.
yeah, I'm the Route County manager about 4.5 years. Prior to that, I was the Carbondale town manager,
Oh, cool.
Cortez city manager, Telluride town manager, and Gosa town manager, but I started out as a county planner in La Plata County, so
Gotcha.
been
recovering land use planning.
you recovering.
Oh,
I just figured if I was gonna do all these night meetings, I might as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for doing that. Cause I sometimes think, oh, folks have already done some of this and then I jump into things. So thanks for pausing me there. And I believe you some folks met with Brad earlier to get kind of the background on everything.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Brad was great, so thanks, Brad.
When did that ask Brad?
Yeah. Great. Okay, so then we're gonna come to, you're gonna get used to our decision-making style, which is through consensus. So we make fist to 5 decisions. Where a 5 is like, I'm in total agreement on this. Fist is, I can't support this. It's a veto. To get to consensus, we need to be at a 3 or above. The last time we met, we did decide on the rebrand for the neighborhood itself to be Slate Creek Neighborhood. We did some brainstorming on what to call this group, knowing like, okay, it's not the same as the group before. It needs to get separated out from BRAC and like what makes this group different. So you all came up with some different ideas. The comms teams took a look at those and are providing the following recommendations and or additional ideas to you. And so I would love to, at this point, open it up for discussion of these and see if we can land on a name for this group.
I would like to add one.
You want to add one? Okay.
Slate Creek Neighborhood Collaborative.
Okay. Let's go ahead and I'm just gonna edit this slide right now. Slate Creek neighbor.
They're all.
Sounds like a quilting organization.
I like steering committees personally. Pretty straightforward. Most people know what that means. Essentially what we're doing.
That is also my preference. But I don't have a strong preference either way, but that would be my.
I think it says like we're finalizing things more than bringing ideas. I like the steering to.
Okay.
I was gonna ask if it'd be Lou, do you want to speak to sort of the intention behind your addition? Sometimes it's helpful just to hear like what the ideas.
It emphasizes the collaboration.
Hmm.
And Slate Creek collaboration team. It's kind of, I don't know,
Mouthful.
that's a mouthful.
I also like Slate Creek Neighborhood Collaborative. I think I like the emphasis on collaboration. I think that's a big piece, like moving forward for us, bringing all these organizations together.
And the only reason I hesitate on the steering committee is that, you know, from a community engagement perspective, is that what the community is looking for us to do? Steer the process, steer the project? You know, or it's, you know, right now, I think this is more process oriented than it is project oriented. So, I mean, that's my Preservation.
I could vote 3 or above on all of these names.
Okay.
I think they are all great, they get the job done, and I'm happy to support all of them. Okay, yeah.
How about steering collaborative?
Yeah, yeah. It's really hard to steer as a collaboration. Just think about driving in a car. Collaborate.
Do with my wife like that.
Right.
So external perspective, things to think about in terms of the feel and optics of these, they're different. One of them I think is going to connotate a little bit more formality and kind of governance structure. One of them, which is probably something that's beneficial. I think the other one, collaborative, sort of gets at an idea of what you guys are trying to do, how you want to operate, which I think also probably brings some value. The concept of incorporating neighborhood from a kind of communications perspective, and in terms of the dynamics you guys have had and some of what you guys have been wrestling with, does fold in an idea that may resonate in terms of where can we find agreement. But again, I think to some degree, as I look at this as an outsider without an opinion, part of it is a decision between, do we want something that sends a message of kind of greater levels of structure and governance, or do we want something that connotates a little bit more around collaboration? And so there's some give on both of those. Like the idea for some people, like Dave said, quilting group, and I thought, I'm not knocking you. I'm saying, some people will find it that way. And on the other hand, some people are going to be like, steering committee. Wow, sounds like a bunch of, hierarchical stuff again. So you can't win at the end of the day. And I think you guys have to be okay with that. There's going to be some people who, because they're looking for things to pinprick, they're going to pinprick your name. At the end of the day, I think it's about you guys feeling pretty good about it and saying like, look, this is the idea we have. And hopefully just landing on something that when you call it out or when it shows up in the newspaper, it's sending the message you guys want.
Gail, what do you think?
I think building on kind of those comments, I had landed on Slate Creek Planning Partnership. I mean, for a little bit of the reasons that were spoken to, right? I mean, in the sense of partnership, kind of leans toward collaboration, but I think planning, it does have a sense of we're working to get something done. So I see the planning partnership as a blend of a bit of governance as well as the fact that we are looking at this as a partnership.
Jay, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, the only issues I have with planning is it actually sounds like a government process, since we all have planning commissions and, different processes associated with planning in our organizations. And I like steering committee, but as Angelica, I can live with either. I don't see this name as the difference between all these names being so different that it changes the direction that we're working on.
So at this point, what I'm gonna have us do, this is a different type of vote than I usually justify because we're kind of talking through 3 options. I'm gonna have kind of in the order they're listed here. Give me a 1 if you want steering committee, a 2 if you want planning partnership, and a 3 if you want neighborhood collaborative. Go ahead and give me your votes there, just so I can see where we're at in the room right now. Okay, so Gail, you're our in-between vote on this.
Oh,
We had 3 1s in the room and 3 3s in the room.
Tiebreaker.
I'm curious if you lean a given way between steering committee and neighborhood collaborative.
well,
Careful.
Pressure's on.
I know, right? I'm just thinking that. I mean, well, again, that's why as I say, I was leaning toward planning partnership because I saw it as a little bit of both. I mean, I certainly heard what Jay said in the sense of, planning, quote unquote, I think to people in this room means something specific. I'm not sure it has that connotation, out in the broader public. Yeah, so I'm open to be convinced. How's that? I mean, I hear what, and again, I think I don't want us to get too hung up on names either, right? In the sense that we've got a lot of things that we need to get through here. So, I mean, so I guess steering committee.
Paper, scissors.
I would probably lean towards steering committee.
Let's go ahead and just test that one out on a consensus vote, knowing that what I've mostly heard is folks feel open to multiple options. But I want to see if you can say no if this isn't going to work for you, and we'll troubleshoot it out. I just don't, like to Gail's point, want to take too much time on things. So go ahead on steering committee, give me a fist of 5 on that. Okay. So then we're going to go ahead and move forward with Slate Creek Steering Committee, SCSC or SC squared.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. All right, great. Okay. Let's see. Then I think that this is about if there's a future need for another team that would actually implement things. That the group would need another name if there was a separate entity. And this is what the comms team came up with for these ones on the execution side of things.
Yeah, no need for a decision. It was just,
Okay.
since we talked about it, we were just floated. You can move on.
Okay, great. So then we can kind of think through if there is, this group continues into an implementation, if there's a separate group, we have some starter dough for what that looks like down the line. All right, so this next piece here, the way that it's gonna flow is I'm gonna have us do some reporting out we gave you some things to check in with your individual boards and councils with the last time we left off. And I want to get some report outs of what you found out from engaging folks in larger conversations about the decisions we're wrestling with. This section will just be a report out. We won't do like necessarily discussion about it. We'll fold it into the next pieces where we break it out step by step. So this gets into what I just said. We're going to just report out. And then you're going to summarize your organization's perspective, not just your own as you're reporting out. So I'll give you a couple things that I asked you to get input on. One of which came up during our last time when we were talking through the group agreements, which is about decision-making guardrails, and was to get a sense from your individual organizations, what can this group be entrusted to make decisions on? And when do we need to go back to them for additional decision-making authority? Then we'll also talk about any thoughts on the end state that we need to decide as well. So let's start here. And maybe I'll leave it up to whoever wants to get us started from whichever org of. Any advice that we got about decision-making guardrails we need to pay attention to? Yeah.
We talked about it extensively at our board meeting. The board members, like that. Since we're not 100% sure exactly how much of this is process, how much of this is deliverable, my interpretation of what we talked about was if it's just process right now, then we'll undertake an iterative process of tell us what you talked about, what you decided, or what kind of questions came up. And then we can talk about whether or not we need to adjust those general guidelines or guardrails as they are. So as long as it's processed, I'm not sure it's as critical as when we get to what are we talking about in terms of deliverables. I don't know if that's fair.
Yeah, that's what I took away also. There were no like specific guardrails. It was generally like, we kind of trust you to like be part of this process, come back with an executive summary of each meeting and we'll go from there.
Emily, would you add anything?
I don't have anything to add on that.
Okay. How about from the city side of things?
Yeah, again, I think, yeah, Gail Gary here for the, you said the city, just, we did bring it up and talk about it at our last council meeting. I mean, I think similar to the comments that have been made, I think it's really important that we continue to be able to, you know, report back to council in terms of what's happened with the conversations, as well as to the extent possible, making sure, you know, that we do have the agendas for the next meeting so that we can get input. I think we're in pretty early stages, but you know, when we kind of fold in what the guardrails are, I think I heard pretty clearly that to the extent when we start talking about finances and particularly, you know, potential financial impact on the community and community residents, that's something certainly that the council wants to be able to weigh in on, as well as when we, you know, as we start talking annexation. I think that is another one of those areas where council is going to want to have some input. And then as I kind of think about it broadly, and while we didn't talk about this, I think council is also going to be concerned about if we're talking about scale or scalable, what, you know, what does that mean? What does that look like? And then specifically, if we're scaling or phasing, you know, what does that look like in the context of the kind of the annexation? So I don't know, Tom, what did I miss?
No, I think that's right. I think it's a little bit like Lou. I think in terms of process, they were fine. Just open lines of communication, make sure that we have just constantly communicating what has been done, what will be done. But anytime we start making decisions that affect the community in terms of finances, then they're in a long way.
Okay. I'm going to return back to YVHA for just a second, because so here we heard 3 specific examples of finances, annexation. Now I'm going to forget the scale. Yep. Scale and phasing. When you all talked about later on in the project, were there specific examples that came up about later on when it gets into more of the project phases that YVHA?
Well, I mean, again, my interpretation is I consider those deliverables.
Okay.
Okay. And those need to be talked about with the board, you know, in an iterative process. You know, so we're gonna have to have something to go back to the board with, and then the board can discuss it. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was my takeaway also. Any like specific planning aspects would be brought back to the board before we made any final decisions.
Yeah.
At least for now is what I'll add. I think there's now a standing agenda item for every board meeting for this topic. And I think that once we have a better understanding as an organization as to what that end state and milestones are and can outline the process, the organization will be able to have maybe a more thorough discussion on the specific guardrails.
Okay.
And when the 3 of us have authority versus what we need to go back to the organization or the board.
Okay.
Yeah, we did have a discussion on the offsetting schedules. Yeah, we meet once a month, city meets once a week. We need somewhere in between, that's this group. So, you know, the logistics associated with that may make it more difficult to get feedback from, you know, any one of the entities at the right time for quoting meeting.
Okay. But from county perspective.
Jane had no rules. Yeah, whatever.
Okay. Looks like maybe it's a little different.
Obviously, Jason, you guys talked to this on the way in.
No, we, the commissioners, we did chat about this and, you know, they have full faith in Jay and I making the decisions that need to be made in these rooms. They made it clear that they want to see a project move forward, that they want to see something come to life, in Slate Creek, and that they want to be supportive of that and engaged. Obviously, we're not going to commit funds and budgets and money to a project like without going back to our team and the commissioners. So any like budgetary conversations will go back, but in terms of engaging in the process and carrying forth the voice of the county and the commissioners, we feel really confident that we can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, most Mondays we'll provide an update after these meetings to the overall board. The county, in some negotiations, YBHA, did, we provided $1 million grant for the first step of this project. And only a small portion is spent. We allowed YBHA to retain $500,000 of that to help for, as we get further into the plan, physically project themselves. So, and I don't see the county wanting to micromanage how that money spent. Any additional county funding is one we'll have to bring back to the entire group, but we already have some chips in for this phase of the project.
And I think like we meet twice a week, every week, publicly, so it's just easier for us to, like Jay said, give the updates on the Monday work session after these meetings and then feel good about where we are. So yeah, we have pretty broad authority, I would say.
Okay. Let's go ahead and chat now about the end state. I might pull it back and just go in a loop of, did YVHA get a chance to talk a little bit about the end state that we had brainstormed, and any thoughts on this?
We talked a little bit about what we had brainstormed, and later on, Emily and I and Shannon met, and I thought Emily came up with a great end state.
Oh, you've got one ready. Okay, well, maybe we'll pull that in because we'll go into end state tomorrow. But any strong kind of trends that came up in discussion about where YVHA stands on what needs to be prioritized in an end state?
Well, I mean, in terms of priorities, I think we're talking, you had to establish 1, 2, 3, housing affordability, sustainability, and community.
Okay.
Is that fair?
Okay. All right, how about from city?
I don't, from a city perspective, I think certainly, we did talk about the phasing, the scaling, talked about the concept of the neighborhood and the fact that that does kind of mean, potentially mixed uses, as appropriate. I don't think at this point there was any strong, kind of leanings one way or the other. So I
It's
think
kind of limited by the constraints talk. Our constraints stuff, we haven't had that results yet.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for bringing that up.
And then anything that you all chatted about as county on this?
We talked about feasibility, when we just kind of gave the recap, like we talked about the timeline that we put up and what we wanted to see and what a lot of people saw the end state being, and for the county, the conversation surrounded, well, we see what the city's capacity is and what their constraints are, because that was fresh and being talked about. But one of the things we also talked about was just getting something done. Like we would like to see an end state where we have a plan to build homes and we have a plan to house people in our community.
Okay.
And just to clarify, I think our discussion on the city's constraints more was focused on what are the infrastructure constraints to support a first phase, not other constraints.
No infrastructure, yeah,
Yeah.
from the study, and like, I think we talked about, we like mentioned, water, we mentioned these things, and just talked about how I mentioned that at the YBHA board meeting, Councilor Mentine said that that study was forthcoming, and so that would help guide a lot of this work, and so I shared that with the commissioner, and so that was a lot of fun.
That's all helpful context as we get into our next decisions. I want to come back to that thing I introduced at the beginning with the timeline on things. Based on these conversations so far, do you feel like your individual organizations, as we go forward and build out the finalized timeline for things to find an end state, will your organizations need to have a final review on that, or does this group have the authority to move that forward? Kind of thinking about, is there a need for all three groups to get into a meeting and get on the same page? Or are we able to move forward with this group?
Just a related question that might actually inform the answer. To the degree that you guys would like to end up using end state broadly in external sort of communications for sort of guiding this work, another question would be, I guess one question is the end state as something you guys are going to define together, something you'll use for this kind of planning work and getting these things defined, or as an overall guide for the project? And the reason that matters is because then you would ask, also, do we not want to involve the community in shaping that vision for the end state we're going towards? And I hope that's not taking you off kilter, but there is the question of, to what degree do you guys want community to be involved in shaping the ultimate vision for a project?
Can I back up with an even more sort of, just like foundation clarification?
Yeah.
Particularly because I wasn't here in the last session. When we're talking about end state, are we talking about what the vision is for what a neighborhood could be at the Slate Creek property? Or are we talking about what the Slate Creek Steering Committee is going to accomplish by a sort of defined time?
So what this group is setting out to accomplish by a defined time, as we've been talking about it, we have been talking about it in terms of, to just say that this is a group that's coming together to design housing or something like that, feels like it's not enough of the description. So we are pulling in these pieces that are some of design elements in some ways of what this group needs to be wrestling with and considering in finally accomplishing together. But in terms of what the actual design of the property looks like and things like that, that's things that get designed in the process.
Okay.
It's
All I'm trying to do is acknowledge that those
what
are.
you're accomplishing together. Yep.
I was kind of under the impression that this phase was just about the governance and not about any vision planning. And so I was kind of wondering how long you anticipate we will be with you folks before you turn us loose to get into that envisioning phase. So in that terms, where is that end state?
For the rest of your lives.
So part of this, if we go back a little bit, if we think about what is this group moving forward going to accomplish? This is like at the broad level of saying, like one version of that is saying, we're going towards, we're developing another annexation proposal, right? Versus if you took a totally different route, this group has been coming together to figure out, are we all on the same page about what we're trying to achieve together and create as a group in that sense? So that's what, by the end of June, we want to leave you with your milestones of what a planning process would look like and what you're accomplishing. What are you moving towards by having all those milestones go together? In the course of those milestones is this like meta end state, like the vision for the property itself and what it needs to look like, which is developed over the course of the planning process. So to your question, this process of defining how the group works, defining where you're going, ends June, July, depending on scheduling, right? That's where we want to have you in place with milestones, end state. You've already got group membership agreements, decision-making governance, all those pieces put in place. So we've got to tick some of those done. Now we're revising these last pieces, and then you move into actually doing it.
Gil, maybe I'll just build on what you said, because I probably should have outlined my comment a minute ago more as a suggestion than a question, which is to remember, as we're thinking about how much involvement you want from your respective teams in defining end state, that we're using the end state right now to design the work that needs to happen. And that in all likelihood, once you get to that next stage, part of a lot of the work you've already defined is going to be about getting clearer with the community on defining more about the end state. So we need it now so that we're not walking blindly through the woods. And we need to get clear on like, look, we're trying to do these things, because then you can work backwards and say, well, if this is what we're trying to work towards, we're going to need this, and we're going to need that, and we're going to need to do this, and we're going to need to do that. And yet, I think from the dialogue we've had and where you guys are trying to go, there will be additional planning. And we can imagine that part of that will be working with the community and other partners, the stakeholders, to more clearly define the vision, probably at multiple scales, for what you guys are going to do and to be trying to build should this all work out successfully. I hope that's helpful. I was sort of putting it as a question, and I probably should just said, remember that.
Yeah, I may be speaking out of turn because I'm not a board member, but to get to your original question about whether or not we need to get all of these groups for our boards together. I guess I would hope that we don't have to, and that we do have the authority within our individual organizations to decide on an end state before having a conversation with this group here, and then starting to work for these lines.
Yeah, and I would add, I agree with that. I'm not sure how the rest of the board would actually feel about that. And I also am a little confused on the public engagement side. You know, if we're gonna even come to quote our end state as was described, then does the public need to be involved in that perspective? And I'm not sure. I think.
I still go back to the same question, which is what end state are we talking about? The governance group? Or
Yeah,
are we
yeah,
talking about
that's,
building something around
The
range.
governance group.
it's the governance.
So if it's just a governance group, I don't think the community needs to weigh in on the governance.
Well, we're gonna establish, I guess, some framework, I would think, for what an end state would be and then what would be planned. That's my guess.
That is what we're developing.
That is, I mean, that's kind of, you know, touches on all the issues that were in conflict during the last annexations.
We need to use different terms.
Okay,
Because I don't think that what we're talking about at the end of this groups is a plan.
I agree.
And I would say.
But it's a framework.
We're helping you think through a process that you're going to use. And I think you guys are actually raising up an important point that we didn't get to probably in the last conversation, which is like making sure that in thinking about the steps we need to take in that longer term process that we're helping you think through, that we don't overlook kind of the more internal end state of making sure we're clear on defining, like, by June, we want this body to be what. And I appreciate your comment, because I think where you're coming from is like that there's an end state that we're talking about in terms of a future, what could happen on that property. And then there's an end state that I think Dave is bringing us towards of like, well, at the end of June, what are we trying to do? Am I correct in sort of?
I mean, I think if we facilitated the governance component and how we make decisions, then the idea is as they come forth in the next phase will be a whole different target, right? There'll be a new end state for that phase, which will include all the planning, the community engagement. We're just trying to get the process of how we work together. At least that's the way I was.
Yeah,
Well,
I agree.
Actually, can I chime in? Yeah, so I mean, I hear the discussion and I hear what's being said, but when I look at like the presentation for today and some of the things that we're talking about, I mean, we are talking about an end state, right? We are talking about not just from a governance perspective, but we're talking about the components of, you know, a potential, you know, what will be developed out there, right? To the extent that, I mean, even if we look at this, the list here, right, scaled. So we're talking about phasing, you know, homes for our community, mix of uses. So it's getting a little blended for me from in the perspective that yes, it's governance, but it's also, you know, what in order to set milestones and know what kind of questions we want to ask, we need to know where we're headed. And so, you know, I think that we are talking about, you know, what's kind of the potential of what, you know, gets developed out there. And to that end, back to kind of the original question, and I keep saying this, that we can't over engage either any of our bodies and or the community, right? I mean, in terms of wanting input all along the way about this and, you know, and kind of end this end state. So does that mean that we all, the three bodies get together or we take these back individually, right? I mean, in terms of consistent messaging, I'm not quite sure if that's what you're, Kale and Clark, what you're asking. You know, I think absolutely we each need to take these back to our individual bodies and get input. if you're asking, do the three bodies need to get together? You know, I think we should talk through that too.
Okay. Let's go ahead and return to the question about whether or not the bodies get together at the end of tomorrow a little bit. We can think about this, they're interrelated when we think about the different ways that we describe the end states for things, which is why I think it's confusing. At the broadest level, you can think about, we're articulating this group is responsible for making decisions about the future of Slate Creek neighborhood. Now that might feel too broad to some folks, and so we need another layer of a more defined end state of this group is coming together to design housing solutions for Slate Creek neighborhood. Well, for some folks, that feels too limited to just say housing solutions. We need to say community solutions. Then there's the actual planning sort of vision for the property that gets into, I think, some of the examples we saw in the brainstorm last time, that's build 500 units by X date, right? We're probably at a middle tier of this for thinking through, if folks come to you and ask, what is Slate Creek Steering Committee doing? You want to be able to say, we're working on toward X, right? That's what we're defining in this stage of the process. But that lower level of, we're going to create 500 units by X date to serve this AMI, that's coming up in the planning process. Does that help to kind of talk through tiers of that?
It does.
Okay.
The only reservations I have, and they're not, but this is an open question, is I would hate to think that we come to the end of June, or July, or whenever it is, what our message to the community is, who decided how to make a decision. Okay. I don't think that's enough. I think it has to be something different than that. Yeah, it has to be more than that. I mean, that's my feeling. And I don't know how much more than it is. Do we want some, like I said, some of the framework associated with what this vision of Slate Creek is? And that's just it's an open question. But I don't know how you guys feel.
Where's the cost for this looking at?
Jay?
I see it more as putting a roadmap forward. We're sitting here looking at the different touch points and, okay, what's the process beyond this? Just a little bit more than governance, but like, what's the roadmap forward on this? And what are the steps we're going to take to, everything from public engagement to the actual detailed planning to annexation? Like, what are those steps and how do they line out over a period of time as we get to the end of June or July? I think that's my thought process.
Jay, how much detail do you think we need though, right? I mean, I hear what you're saying about a roadmap, and questions and milestones. How much what are the, how do we make sure that we're making the right decisions, right? I mean, in the sense of when we talk about scalable, right? Or we talk about, just a phased development, what's there, whether, how much commercial, how much specificity do you think we need to put together an adequate roadmap?
I'll put me on the spot, Gail, huh? I mean, I don't know if there's a clear answer on that. I think one of the things we talked early in this process was building on all the work which has been done already as opposed to recreating it. So to me, part of that roadmap is acknowledging, here's the data we have already as it relates to this. Maybe there's some things which need to be updated, but let's not go backwards and recreate all the other work which is done. Acknowledge the work in place, all the studies, all the details, and then how do we build that as a path forward for a scaled neighborhood?
But I do think if we talk about scenario planning, which is really what the roadmap is going to lay out, there's a lot of data and information we're going to need for each of the scenarios developed. And that ultimately, Gail, I think is decided in some respect by the community and the feedback we get on the scenarios. So there's a fair amount of information that we're going to need to get there.
Gail, did you say that we're talking about the end state tomorrow?
Yeah. So I think that we're starting to get into the next section as we think about milestones. To this piece, I'm gonna come back to Lou for a second of thinking about what's the deliverable on this phase and is it enough for a second? I'm gonna, you kind of have two options here, right? Which is like, you can extend this period and give more details, but to your earlier point, you may also need to do more community engagement in this phase to be able to get those. Or we can quickly get you to the outline of where you're headed and then get you into it so you can go. And my feeling is I want to get you into that second version where we get you into a roadmap. You can communicate to the community, here's where we're headed. And then you hit off to the races on them. So that, and then, but then we need to get really clear about in that roadmap process, when are we doing community engagement?
I mean, I'd hate to see us not reach out to the community and get some input how to do that effectively.
Well, that's what we're gonna talk about.
We're gonna talk about,
No.
okay, so I may have made this more convoluted, but this is, I think, part and parcel of the work that this group has to do to make sure we're on the same page for each of these steps to be able to move quickly. So we're gonna go back into now.
Before we leave this, I want to just make one clarifying point that actually I think we're there, and I think sometimes visually this is important to so you can see it. This isn't everything, but if we just sort of think of ourselves, and I think Jay said it well, like we're on a roadmap. It's not this linear, but in the interest of sort of offering a sense of time scale, like we're going this direction towards what we've been talking about is some understanding of what a Slate Creek neighborhood that we can all get behind is. Because if you remember how we've set up the last conversation was like, let's see where we can agree on some things of what an outcome could look like that we could all get behind, right? We need to start there. There's a lot of, then we said, well, like, what is all the stuff we're going to need to do to get there? And we spent a lot of time talking about things that are going to be kind of in here. We talked about, you know, a new plan. I didn't get a chance to write up, you know, some feasibility analysis, your constraints analysis, scenarios are going to be a component of this. To Tom's point, ultimately, you know, these things are going to happen before there can be an annexation agreement, before there can be a community vote. So there's things that are going to need to happen. And I think a point that's important that I just want to make sure we're all sort of seeing is that I'm hearing some people say there's actually a milestone that we may have left out. And it's this question of making sure that by the end of, and Dave, I think you in particular sort of articulated this for me, that by the end of the process that we're doing together, we also need to, let us not forget that we want to set this group up for success in terms of being really clear in definition of like, making sure we're clear on how we're going to operate moving forward. We're helping you set up the governance. Let's make sure that we've defined that the end of this process, one end state is a governance end state, which is a Slate Creek steering committee is like geared up and ready to go. The things that you guys need are clear. I think that's the main thing that we were getting a little confused on there in terms of the different end states. Now, you know, again, once we sort of look at it in a roadmap context, it's important to be like, yeah, the reason we need to do that is so that we can then go forward and do all of these things. So it does all fit together. But does that align with how people see it? And does that help clarify anything, or did I just muddle the waters even more?
No, I agree with that.
Okay. Tom's out.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's how I see it.
Great.
So with that, we're gonna jump into revising our decision-making timeline. And Clark, do you want to go through a couple of your slides here?
Yeah. This one's yours, so I'll let you kind of tee us up. And then
Okay,
we'll
so
go from there.
just as a reminder from last time, we split it out into milestones, questions, and engagement opportunity. As we talk about revising this, we're gonna start at the layer of milestones in particular and dive deeper into that with a focus on questions. We're gonna hold off on the engagement opportunities for now because we're gonna do a deeper dive into that tomorrow. But we're gonna really just flesh out our milestones and questions at this point. There you go, Clark.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but I'm having a hard time understanding how we can talk through the milestones, questions, and community engagement when we are saving the, like, coming to an agreement on what the end state is for tomorrow. I guess just with my own sort of like I'm a project manager, my own process is what is the end result of the project? And then that's when I put in all of my, on the milestones, the deliverables they get me along the way. So I'm
Good, because that's where we're gonna start. So the first thing I think we'll want to do is we'll just start with kind of a reminder of what you guys landed on with an understanding. I think we all, one of the things that's challenging here is we all have to appreciate that there's complexity in that for this group to move forward and start figuring out a process, we have to gain some clarity on what success could look like on this property. We've given it a new name. We're starting to get some alignment around what that could be. And so far, here's what you guys have come up with. Is, you want an appropriately scaled project that creates neighborhood that improves affordability with homes for our community. Everything that's underlined here was in that list that we just looked at, with complementary mix of uses, and it's got to be feasible and it's got to be supported by our community. We added a couple elements that were actually given to us as milestones, but they landed here because they were more a part of a, sort of this successful end state, which one was a successful annexation and a thoughtful phased approach. One could argue that this kind of maybe comes, a little further over this way because it enables that. But I'm just going to put these kind of in here. They were additions. And then the other was a successful neighborhood with desired outcomes for families, workers, retirees, and families. So what all this lets us do is, I think, Emily, what you're describing, which is have a sense of a goal in mind, like what does success look like, so that we can work backwards towards, well, what's it going to take to do that? So if you were to think through a lot of what we did last time, well, the semantics of this stuff can get funky, right? But at the end of the day, when we're talking about milestones, we're asking like, what needs to happen? And these need to be sort of definable points in the roadmap that you described, so that we can get that really clearly laid out. And so if we were to sort of review some of the things that we talked about, and I'm going to come back, I want to sort of bring us back to this, but just to sort of make sure we're clear going into this conversation, we talked about some things that are to provide us information. For example, we complete a feasibility analysis, so we have the information we would need to make decisions. Some things were sort of just base political steps that need to be accomplished. Like if this is going to be successful at this point, the way we're all conceiving of it, there would have to be a vote of the community that would enable it to move forward. So that was, a milestone that you guys identified. You guys identified a milestone of, a new community plan for the neighborhood. And so it's because we're able to look at these things and say, well, if we want a neighborhood that improves affordability as just one piece of this, what are the things we're going to need to get there? So that's the idea. And so the reason that once we will want to confirm, and we could move things around and come back to end state now, but I think spending more time defining these points, I think may not be as productive for now, at least the way we sort of thought things through, as saying like, this is pretty good. Let's make sure we feel okay about it right now, which is to say, like, if there's anything that feels like a glaring gap, partly Kale opened up this opportunity in terms of, did you guys, anything come up in your conversations with your boards that might influence how we're thinking about this? But as long as this feels like, yeah, that's pretty good, version of success, we're probably gonna, we can tweak that. And certainly if, when we get into a planning process, I imagine you guys are gonna want to invite the public to help give voice and language to that. But I think the reason you guys landed here is because you already have a sense of what the public is probably gonna be talking about. And so we can sort of begin with that tentative vision of success and then work backwards. And so what we'd like to do in this next stage is confirm those milestones and identify what we didn't come up with, because there are some pieces that I think we're missing. And then there's some pieces that we kind of put out there, but probably needs clarification. So, want to see if that satisfies, at least for the moment, your curiosity.
Yeah, I guess that's why I tried to clarify what are we talking about when we say end state, because to me, this is a vision that needs to be confirmed in the community, but it's
For
a
sure.
vision that we are all collectively working toward. When I hear end state, I'm thinking of what is the deliverable of the Slate Creek Steering Committee. So that's why that's why I'm confused.
And
Where I'm like a little, to me, this seems like an end state of the next step, not the end state of this group. Like to Dave's point, when we are done working, when you all, I don't know when that is, but like by the end of June, July, whenever this is not the end state that this group is gonna present in June, July. This is what we would eventually like to see in Slate Creek. So I'm also like a little bit, there's a disconnect. To me, if we're talking about what are the deliverables of the Slate Creek Steering Committee, the deliverables, instead of saying appropriately scaled project, the deliverable should be a roadmap that outline, you know what I mean, X, Y, Z, because that is what, that outlines governance structure, that outlines potential like plans and steps and yada, 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 whatever we want to say. But to me, this is the end state of the second half, not this group.
And the second part would have like scenario planning, and then from the scenario planning into public engagement. More scenario planning based upon public engagement. And I mean,
And I stand by this vision. Like, I think this is an excellent vision. I stand by everything on there. I don't see anything that I don't think anyone in this group disagrees with, but I don't think that's the end state for what Slate Creek Steering Committee is going to deliver in June or July. We're not gonna deliver a scaled project in June or July.
No. And I don't think that's the intention. This is really, I think that's what I was trying to say earlier, is that I'm agreeing with you guys. I think you're right. And I'm saying that's a gap. So one of the things we'll want to add in today, I think when we started thinking about end state, we were, and I actually think it makes sense because part of what you guys are on the hook for at the end of, our work together in early July, is we want to, part of that roadmap, a major part of that roadmap is a process. We want to help you guys think through a process. And so where I think we are here is to have a sufficient clarity of the long-term vision of success, recognizing exactly what you said, which is that, and I've said it too, we're going to need to give the community voice in shaping that vision. And yet for now, we can say, look, I think what can we agree on? Because remember also, over the last couple of meetings, part of what we've been trying to do after bringing a new group together is to say, can we get some alignment around where we're going? And, can this group agree on the idea of something on the Slate Creek property, which wasn't a given, 2 months ago when we began. So I think that's part of wanting to make sure that if everybody in this group was able to look at this, which we did last time, and be like, this all feels right. I'm okay with these as things that we're trying to create out there. It helps us know what we're moving towards. So I think what we were going to want to do is spend some time today, in addition to any process milestones, which is a lot of where I think we have some good starting points, and make sure there's a sort of nearer term set of milestones that are around governance, and asking ourselves questions like, we need to make sure, do we have a clear roadmap for our work? Is our government structure clear so that we are poised to make decisions in the next stage? Are we clear on what those specific decisions we're going to be making are? Does that capture the types of things that you're getting at in terms on the governance side?
Yeah, I want to recognize Gail's hand as
Yeah.
well, so I'll hand it over to her, but really quick, I just think we need to write on this board, like, by July, the Slate Creek Steering Committee will have
X.
like
Yeah.
X.
That's one of the
we
things.
need, like,
I'm gonna come back to our first set of slides for this question, but Gail, go ahead.
Oh, no, that's okay. Thank you. I think, Clark, what you just said provides the clarity that I needed in the sense of, and I think this is what I was prompted my question to Jay too, is right, what, to the extent that we need to have some sort of end state, right, in order to provide the roadmap. So that, I think what we have defined in terms of a vision, and I think that's, I guess, what the way we need to think about it is, this is the vision and this is where we want to end up, right, in terms of then defining, okay, what's the roadmap for how we get there?
Yeah, Emily.
If appropriate, I'd love to throw like an end state option out there. And I don't mean the vision, I mean like a deliverable of the government. If it was appropriate.
Okay, give me 1 second to just pull up. Give me 1 second, because this is gonna get messy for a second.
Dave. You laughing at me?
No, we're trading yards.
You know, I'm a little self-conscious up here with all the tape tearing and paper, the only noise in the room.
Okay, so when we first met as a group, which I know membership has changed over time, so I just wanted to bring us back here. Yes. Okay, so this is what we made a consensus decision about what this group is doing. So we said we would develop a revised version of a steering committee, and we would need to determine membership, decision-making, the role with community engagement, and communication practices for transparency. We said we would define an end goal. This is this end state we're talking about for a future annexation proposal and or an alternative if we weren't moving towards like, what is this group tasked with doing? That's the end state we're talking about. And we would produce an outline of annexation roadmap for Brown Ranch with key milestones. Now that's become Slate Creek. Right? So this is I want to revise the language. When we're talking about what this group is accomplishing, we've already outlined this, and this is the objectives for this governance group in this first phase of 6 meetings. This is what we're working towards producing as a group. So that one has been defined, but we can look at this and say, oh, actually, I think we need to incorporate something different in what we're producing by June, July. That's where this is what we're doing in order to say SC is ready to go.
Yep.
Is we're developing all of this. The end state we're developing, this define an end goal for a future annexation proposal is as we're developing the roadmap, we need to have a statement of where this roadmap is headed to in terms of what this group needs to accomplish. And this is the end state we're defining. What I am hearing in this conversation is that this end state needs to be broad enough that it's not overcommitted before we do community engagement, but it needs to be specific enough that we can design milestones along with it. So even if this is just given our draft of kind of where we think we're headed in some ways, that's useful for just keeping up here for now. But I wanted to be clear that I don't think we need to revisit what this group is seeking to accomplish together. So that's what we outlined here. Does that feel like by the end of June, July, we feel good with continuing with these being our objectives?
I think we're kind of all saying the same thing, which is, we can't envision the end state. We could get the roadmap to get there, but we can't make that our end state. Our end state should improve is just governance. Because we will have to go back to our respective boards and committees to along that whole line process.
Yeah, I think this quote unquote roadmap is great. Like, we're gonna determine, by the end of July, we will have determined membership, we will have determined a decision-making process, we will have determined what the future community engagement looks like. We will have determined best practices for transparency. You know what I mean? So I think that's what we want to see. And I think to Clark's point, we had skipped a step. Like, we need to go back to this before we finalize what that looks like.
Well, part of what I was trying to say that probably wasn't articulated is sort of that we're like this, I recognize, and if there's any gaps in this too, we can look at it, but this is an appropriate piece, but what we're trying to do is help you guys look beyond this point and see this within the longer timeline of what this group's actually going to be working towards. And so to acknowledge, Kale, I'm glad you went back to that sort of fundamental starting point. Good. And I have been missing one, so I'm just getting the language correct. Yeah.
That slide helpful to go back to those initial 3 objectives. Yes, it was helpful. I think admittedly, I'm just, I'm a project manager too.
It's a lot to take in.
I'm just trying, like, I have put a lot of thought into the whole roadmap and the milestones and the kind of sub milestones along the way. And I'm just like, get going. Yeah.
Well, and Tom's point, do we need just to use different? We keep using end state and then it's like confusing and you know what I mean? So maybe we just need to start differentiating, like, what are the deliverables of this process? And then what's the end state of that parcel,
Okay, so these are gonna be our governance group objectives. Is what we're trying to accomplish together. Our governance group objectives are these things. Then one of those things that we have to do is create a roadmap, which is what we're gonna work on now in further refining it. And I'm gonna adjust just a little bit of language on this. What we've been referring to as an end state, I'm going to say this is our group's purpose of what we're trying to accomplish is what we need to define, right? So it's gonna be our group's purpose is what we're defining. That being said, there's probably a milestone in here of developing a vision statement for Slate Creek neighborhood. That's much more detailed. That's going to be a milestone within that. So we've got governance group objectives. We have defining the group's purpose, and then we'll have a vision statement for Slate Creek neighborhood. That's a milestone in the process.
Part of I just understand work sequentially, like we've been working on these things and we'll there's probably hopefully on membership we're good now. Part of, if you recall back what we were doing last time, is starting to be able to connect the dots with, and part of why we also need to outline this process. So we want this roadmap for how we're gonna get there, in part also so that we can be clear on what's our role in community engagement. But to have that clarity too, it's really helpful to sort of see like, oh, this is all the stuff that's gonna have to happen. How are we gonna play into that? Are we gonna take all that on? Do we need to, think about some other supportive structures? And then same thing with communication. So just to know some of the other elements we're trying to help you guys get towards.
At this point, I'm just looking at time. Does anybody need like a 10-minute break? And then we'll jump into roadmap and milestones. Or you want to keep going?
Yeah, I'd like to throw out the one thing I think we talked about at the last meeting was having a developer, either consultant or somebody in the room early on in this sort of roadmap planning so that we're not like stepping on our toes, not understanding from a development perspective and what's realistic in the roadmap that we're doing everything. And I don't know if we wanted to discuss that, you know. I had reached out to Kim Kringle, Gorman, and she wanted to do it, but her schedule's too full. But she wanted to volunteer. I don't know if we have any contacts that would help us with that. Access.
I've actually did talk to Clay Cruz. And she's very interested. No, I think involving developers, it may be. Not sure exactly where all the timing is for all of this, but having an advisory committee made up of several developers. Yeah, I don't know, and I'm just throwing that out there. Fully developed thought.
So this is exactly the types of questions we want to get into as we build out the roadmap, is a question of when and how do we engage with developers? When and how do we engage with different advisory committees and communities? So let's just dive into all the milestones with what I'm hearing is you'd like to engage developers early on in the process and have them be part of this group. But he's going to give us our broad strokes and we're going to fit these little pieces into that whole roadmap picture. Okay, and I will switch back to our other slides.
Okay, I'm gonna hand some of these out again so that we can add some milestones as needed. So if you guys can kind of circulate these, grab a couple for yourselves and then pass some on. And you all have markers to work from. And then, yeah, let me know when we're back to the other slides.
Ready.
Awesome. So before we dive into this, wanted to just sort of offer some perspective and things where we were looking at what you guys came up with. And in the interest of time, because sometimes it's helpful just to outline some things that are, probable that you're going to want to look at. So first of all, these are the things that you guys covered, and I'm going to put these up on the wall in a minute so we can build on them. But clarifying priorities, feasibility analysis, and this is more or less in order from the way you guys had it. Scenarios, agreement, and again, using the language you guys had, agreement on the percentage of initial phase annexation uses, which that is something I want to make sure we understand because that we have that down, but I don't totally understand it. Completing a development plan, decision on annexation, go, no go, annexation agreement, vote, finalize entitlements. That gives, I think, the beginning skeletal parts of some of the key things. As we, maybe before you, well, yeah, let's just jump into it in the interest of time. As we looked at this, or I looked at it, began thinking about some other things that would probably be helpful. One is, making sure we have an engagement strategy, new planning process, agreeing on vision and goals with the community, agreeing on constraints, well, you guys can look at these, we can decide. I wanted to give us a menu of starting points. And some of these are sort of building on elements that you guys had, but trying to add definition to them. So taking the concept of scenarios to completing a scenario planning process or using scenario planning analysis to identify a preferred scenario, completing a development plan, which I guess actually we do have, and then a development partnership strategy, and then potentially, and this came up earlier, the question of whether a long-term governance model for an eventual built project is something to define. Those are just some things that were sort of internal considerations that, we can begin, see if any of those make sense. And I think you guys can be able to identify some other gaps. Sometimes it's not, sometimes I prefer to work from a blank slate and let you guys come up with this, but I know you guys want to get things going. So we thought we'd at least begin building some things out. And then here are some questions that I wanted to, and I'm sure there are additional questions Is there any way that we can just minimize Gail for 1 second so we can see that?
Oh,
Yeah.
no.
Sorry, Gail, we gotta minimize you. Just for 1 sec. Okay, Chris changed, right? Yeah. So these are some things if you were sort of, if a person had spent some time reviewing the milestones that we had might have surfaced. One that I had was we have this existing study underway around constraints. That feels like it might be a useful thing to add to the milestones and understand how a constraints analysis and feasibility analysis play together. Another, so that sort of comes in here, just defining what those, does this make sense? One way to think about this is, your constraints analysis kind of defines the box you're working within, and your feasibility analysis helps define what you can do within it. That's kind of a typical way of understanding those things, but it's important that we all can kind of agree on that. And then part of this was, getting it at beyond June. Do we need additional governance and decision-making milestones, specifically longer term for the project? And is that something you guys want to think about here? Thinking about in terms of a phasing strategy, that's something that came up a lot in conversation, but not during the actual milestones conversation. We talked about it's got to be a thoughtful phased approach, but making sure that there's a strategy for that. And then things, similarly, like how do we actually decide what the right scale and approach for phasing is? Because we talk about phasing and scale sometimes in a way where we're aligned on what that would be. And of course, part of that, those are things we'd figure out from the community. And so maybe these are just things that we're going to define from our feasibility analysis and community engagement. So I'll just leave these here and see if these are some questions that I think would be helpful to cover. Another one that I was curious about is we had a milestone that was present new vision to community. And I think this got at a discussion we had and didn't fully resolve last time. And I think I have a sense of where you guys want to go. But this sort of the way it is implies that there maybe one way to and see this is that this implies that this group is developing a vision and then presenting it. Another is just that there would be a vision that would be created and then they would be taken out to the community. I think it's important that we just make sure we're defining, who's ultimately shaping the vision that would be, put out to the community as this is it. This is what we're working toward. I think another one when we talk about scale is whether you guys are thinking about this Slate Creek neighborhood and even this sort of vision we were talking about there of a neighborhood, a scaled neighborhood. Is that a first phase or is that the whole completed effort, recognizing that a first portion of that would be phase one? And then the role of scenarios, I think, would be really important, partly because I think some people in the room know what those concepts mean and how we'd use it, and some people don't. And then I think at some point we're going to want to spend time thinking about when decisions are made around local funding. I'm sure there are other questions. So I guess what I would ask you guys is when you were looking at the list of, and maybe you could go back a slide here of existing milestones. Are there other questions that you think we want to make sure we kind of capture before going into building out and kind of covering the gaps on any milestones that we didn't get? You can go back to, I'm not sure which one's most useful to look at.
I would think you'd move scenarios down one and put agreement on percent of initial phase annexations above it.
So one of your things is sort of, let me take that, is sort of the sequence of these, like what is, and that's actually a question I have too, is like, what's the appropriate sequence of these things? Like where does scenarios play in? And so you're saying, we'd figure out what portion of the initial phase we're working with. Is that what that basically means? Does anybody remember who said this?
It was commercial versus residential versus multifamily versus market rate, but.
Well, I think it's actually more than that. It's also size. And I think that we're gonna have multiple scenarios.
Well, that's limited by the constraints analysis, right? That is what it is.
Yeah, but one of the other items that we talked about, or was up there before, was talking about the whole site, talking about a piece of the site. I have a hard time envisioning the entire site. You know, development plans for the entire site. I do. I'm not sure how we would implement that, or how would we accept it. So to me, you are back looking at phasing. Well, then you look at phasing, you're looking at, sequential activity. So phase one is this, that's a scenario. You know, so and I think that's what the percent of initial phase is, are we talking about multiple annexations?
So this is great. Let's focus in on this because it was one of my questions. Can you go back to the questions one? Let's spend a minute and just talk about what we mean, like what the intention of scenarios are. And 'cause I don't know that everybody knows what that means. So, does somebody want to just spend a minute and talk about how scenarios play into this? What a sort of scenario planning model might look like? I can't, but I'm happy to give that to somebody else.
Yeah, I can take my interpretation of this. So coming up with a number, let's call it 2 to 3 different scenarios, development scenarios, so different types of unit mix, just land use in general, affordability. There can be a number of different kind of scenarios that would go into it. I think it would be important that all of the scenarios that we're looking at are feasible. And then also having a sort of business as usual, do nothing scenario as a baseline to evaluate the others against. And then at the same time, coming up with ways to evaluate those scenarios that, in my mind, would be really helpful to kind of look at some of the really difficult trade-offs that we have to make with them. So some ideas of trade-offs could be affordability, so like density, number of units, number of people served, traffic impact, climate impact. There could be a whole number of scenarios, but they should be rooted in difficult trade-offs, subsidy per unit, cost per unit, those types of things. Difficult trade-offs that are also kind of rooted in values. And then once we have those evaluation metrics, evaluating those 3, 4, 5 scenarios against each other and coming up with a preferred scenario to then really dig into, to then create a development plan. That's my understanding of what a scenario analysis would be in this context.
Anybody else want to add any to that? Just, Brad, and you have a lot of experience with scenarios. Other people want to add to the group understanding, because then what we're going to do is we're going to actually like unbundle some of these a little bit and then break down the scenario planning part, because it's a pretty significant portion. And so part of what we need to do is like define the milestones a little bit more in terms of depth and get into some of the big ones. So just before we start diving in and unbundling it, it'd be just helpful for us to build up. So is there anything we might have missed?
I mean, I think Emily did a really good job describing it. I think the one thing I would add is that the evaluation piece is primarily done by public feedback.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah.
Because we have to sell it to them.
They ultimately are going to approve it.
So before we go through all the analytics, just getting a conceptual from community buy-in.
And this is where I think you end up with a big scenario and little scenarios. You have a phased project, you have a scenario for phase one. And that you look at different elements in that. The mixed use, how big are we talking about? What are the constraints? Phase one. Okay, but the bigger scenario is, what do you do with that whole site?
So hang on.
What's going to be here?
Here's where language and like combining things can be, just let's make sure. Because the word scenario is one of those ones that can apply to a lot of things. And you're getting at one of the questions too, which was like, what are we focused on first? And is it important for us to define the scale of an initial phase for planning? Or is the planning work that we need to do comprehensive to the site, with the idea that with that broader vision, we will then come up with a phasing strategy? And I just want to be clear, you don't have to, like, you guys need to think about that, but you can do either way. It could work both ways. You could say, we know we want to go at a, we're gonna have to have a larger sort of bigger picture look at this, but for right now, we think we'll be more successful engaging the community and thinking about a smaller piece. Another argument on the other side of that could be, it will be easier to engage the community in like a broader vision and then bring them down to a more detailed planning for a smaller piece. And so that's one question you're getting at. Another question is, just the terminology of scenarios. You're saying like there's a scenario where, and in this case, that's different than a little bit what we're talking about, which is using a specific kind of planning and modeling approach to identify a preferred plan, a preferred scenario, is generally what it's called, where you take a couple different options and say, here's one option, it's gonna look like this. We're gonna do pepperoni, onion, and straight mozzarella. Another option is gonna be, Hawaiian. And then we're gonna do this option, which is pure veggie. And then in the end, the community sort of spends time analyzing those. And you mentioned metrics. So some of the metrics they might come up with to evaluate the scenarios might be, how many calories, which is the healthiest one? Some of it might be, what's the one that the most, that gives us the most protein? There's different ways we could evaluate that to then generally what happens is you mix the best parts of what you learn from each scenario to create a preferred scenario. So it's not necessarily you have to pick pepperoni, Hawaiian, or veggie, but then instead you realize if our perfect way forward might actually be, a combo of the veggie and Hawaiian, because a lot of people actually do like green peppers and mushrooms with the Hawaiian. And so that's a scenario planning model. I know you're like, well, who would do that?
I think you have to order a pizza.
Food around.
At least beer.
How we get dangerous.
So that's the approach. That's how they work. Now let's break down some what we talked about inside of that. I think we should hold off on the phasing question for now, because to me, it's one of these things that can be chicken and egg and we can get lost in the cycle. So first, let's just break down the scenarios side of it so that we can sort of say, what are some of the milestones inside this milestone, in part to make sure we have definition and shared understanding of what we're moving towards, because that is, to Tom's earlier point, it's a pretty big piece. And secondarily, just to sort of understand what it's going to take to get there. Perfect.
3 that came up in that.
Okay. So we want to be able to, these are some things that were captured so far. So we want to be able to evaluate the scenarios in our public engagement process of using public feedback. We want to get to a place where we have a preferred scenario. So in a way, if this becomes more thematic, this is actually the milestone. The preferred scenario is what you guys want to move towards. And then we have one element of it is sort of value trade-offs. So this would imply we have to define some of those things, right? So we're gonna have to define values, or at least I guess the better way to say this is we need to define what we're evaluating scenarios off of. There's another thing you brought up. Somebody write that out.
Sorry, I took all of your papers with me because
I feel
And we don't need to overdo scenarios, but I want to make sure it's defined out enough that we can understand how it plays with the other parts. So what are some other, okay, so we need to make sure. So part of it is we're evaluating them and we're getting community support that points us towards this is the preferred scenario. So this evaluation, looking at the scenarios, getting public feedback, we will use to determine a preferred scenario.
I think we need to identify expert support to be able to perform this scenario analysis. And I think that this is a great opportunity to engage a developer to do so. Rather than necessarily having a developer on the steering committee, but hiring someone to perform this scenario analysis.
Emily,
It's a pretty technical process.
question for you, because I was gonna say that, but does that go under feasibility analysis? Like, do we need to bring that developer on to do the feasibility analysis to then help us determine the scenarios? So, because I was gonna say developer too, but I didn't know if it was under scenarios or if it's actually the step before, to Dave's point, the earlier, do we want to bring them, like, I guess, where do you see that?
I think so. So one, there's the constraints analysis of just what are the, what are the constraints for the city of Steamboat Springs to be able to provide service to the neighborhood? That's one part of that's one part of that analysis, but there's also the, other elements of feasibility.
Okay.
That a developer would help us with.
Okay.
But I do think it's important that any scenario that we present to the community within the scenario analysis is feasible.
Right, and has a developer who says, is on board and says this can be done.
Yes.
I think feasibility analysis is sort of intertwined with the scenario analysis. It's not a distinct step.
Yeah,
Okay.
that.
I feel honestly, if it's not feasible, it wouldn't be a scenario.
Exactly.
Sorry, I got lost. So let me just make sure I'll come back to whatever you guys are talking about. We were talking about the technical expertise, both in feasibility analysis and then in scenario modeling. There could be overlap, but they're probably both necessary. The world of, you're gonna want to, and understand that I'm gonna be in the spot today where I'm both helping you guys sort of think through this, facilitate, but I have enough knowledge about this too, that I'm gonna allow myself to sort of offer some places where I'm gonna fill in, help color in the lines with you guys. The universe of people that do scenario modeling isn't like giant. There's plenty of them, but I'd say relative to the amount of people who can do sort of feasibility studies and stuff, it's a different group, but they are both intertwined. And here's where they're intertwined is for you to do an effective scenario modeling and analysis to get to a preferred scenario, you're gonna have to have these defined constraints. You're gonna have to understand what's the box we're working within and what are the sort of constraints within that box. So I want to come to those two next and sort of build those out a little bit, but let's make sure we have enough fleshed out here to help us. So we're saying, well, ultimately, there's this whole scenarios component, and that's going to help us determine a preferred scenario. We're going to get there through a process that's going to, incorporate or engage some technical expertise in guiding us through scenario modeling. That approach is going to help us develop different scenarios based on, value trade-offs, constraints, analysis, things like that. And we're going to engage the public in that. And then in order to do that, we're going to have to design metrics to evaluate the scenarios. So as an example, you can do these things based on water usage. You can do this based on just feasibility or return on investment. Like there's a lot of different metrics. You can decide what are the things that matter to us that we want to evaluate these off of. Of course, the more detailed you get and interesting with the data, often the more it costs, but you can get data from most of the things, and then these modeling tools can do that for you. So does this feel, is there anything missing that we would sort of say, well, in order to do these things, we would also need to
I've talked a lot, but
go?
I do think that creating the metrics with which to evaluate the scenarios could be another opportunity to engage the community, and potentially the DST, not the broad community to come up with the metrics, but a community group that's been a little bit more involved in the process.
So good. And here's a bridge into engagement, right? Is there a way you want to use, you're thinking the same thing I'm thinking, Cam. So we'll create a color category here for engagement. Even though some of these already have engagement layer, it's nice to sort of get to that point where we're really specifically talking about it. And one thing you guys might want to think about is essentially a process design as a milestone for this particular part. Like a scenario planning process is a process inside, like you're going to want to plan. I mean, I don't know, Brad, you did this for a long time. You can use it in a more open-ended way, but in terms of what we're talking about, it's almost its own process design within the larger process. Would you agree with that?
Correct.
So
I've decided I'm listening. If I hear anything that's off the rails, I will weigh in. I've not heard anything that's
for everybody to know, like Brad used to do all this stuff all the time in the front range, where, okay, we don't need to go to that. So maybe what we want to do is both capture that in specific kind of engagement component and also a potential milestone might be like, we're going to need an engagement process designed for this. Like whoever probably who we work with for this, the scenario modeling, like we're going to want to work with them on the scenario planning process and how that fits into the larger stuff.
For these, or can we put them, yeah, can we put the yellows down below?
Yep. So we
Because
have that.
What I want us to do here is we're gonna start drafting these pieces of possible community engagement. But we're gonna do a deeper dive into that all tomorrow. So it's kind of just gonna be a placeholder for now, but I don't want us to feel like we have to decide community engagement in order to build out our milestones right now, but I don't want to lose that brainstorming for when we talk about it tomorrow. Okay.
I think by having that line right there, we capture what I was just talking about well enough. Does everybody feel like we have a clearer sense of what we mean when we say scenarios now and how does milestone work and like what we're actually working towards here? Cool. I think we're going to want to have, and also, do we see a little bit more clearly? Because actually it's interesting, like these two, when we did it last time, were sort of like around each other. And I think this really makes it clear that we're using the scenarios to create a development plan. This becomes, all right, that's scenario, the plans I'll be out. Yeah. That feel right in terms of sequence? Great. Let's now move backwards a little bit and talk about feasibility analysis and captured one piece. Can we break this one down a little bit too? What are the necessary sort of sub steps or sub milestones underneath it? Again, as much as anything, so we're all really clear on what it is that we're doing with some of these milestones, because some of these are pretty important, meaty ones. And then the more definition we have, the better we understand how they connect to the next pieces. Because as somebody already said, like this stuff is actually really important for this stuff. Until we have some of that definition, it's a little harder to know, well, which comes first? I actually think our phasing question is going to probably come out of some of these definitions. So is there anything else that we want to say in terms of like components of the feasibility analysis to add definition?
I have a broader question that just came to mind, just on funding this stuff. Like, we don't really have funding as a pink right now. And we're gonna have to pay for, like, the city's already doing a constraints analysis, but you have paid for that, right? And like any sort of feasibility analysis we do, how are we gonna fund that? Where's the money gonna come to identify expert lead, like, I feel like we're missing a step of funding these
Yeah.
things.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's part of the feasibility.
Right,
The reality
But if we're
is,
gonna complete a feasibility analysis, like, are we hiring experts to do that? And then how much does that cost? And who is paying for that? And what does that cost modeling look like? Like, I think we're missing a step in order to do the feasibility and the scenarios in the plan. We gotta have some sort of funding guideline milestone.
if you look at the original plan for Brent Bridge, the question is, how much do you think that would have cost? That was a $1.5 to $2 billion program.
No, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about how much is a plan going to cost. I'm talking about how are we going to fund these milestones? How are we going to fund a feasibility analysis? How are we going to fund the, like, if we are, how are we gonna fund the community engagement? How are we going to fund these milestones? Not with the.
We're at 500,000.
Okay.
You have 500,000 from the county, 100%. You've solved all your problems now. No, but that's what I'm saying is like, we know we have that. Let's add that up. Like, we have that funding. We have 500,000 for a specific thing. Emily did a great job of outlining what that's for. But like, there's other stuff that we will need to do in order to be successful at the feasibility analysis and in developing experts to help us with scenario modeling. So I think adding between defined shared priorities and complete feasibility, which I think is what Clark is doing, is we need to figure out funding. It has to be a milestone to identify that funding.
And you're talking about funding,
Funding the studies.
yeah, planning, support,
Yeah.
funding.
Yes, funding this work, not funding the final project.
So, for the moment, I'm just gonna do basically what you said. Just for, which is identify funding for key milestones. I think it's actually useful to break it down that way, and I think little more simple than trying to do like funding, because in a way, you could add funding like as a.
Oh, totally.
Like your point is just like, we're just gonna have to acknowledge that for each one, there's money we're gonna need for these and where's it gonna come from, which is one of the questions too, like,
And-
where's the money part of this?
Yeah, and I think it has to be almost an upfront conversation. One of the biggest questions we got from the community, you know, is always about funding, and even the free work. And so somewhere along the line, this group is gonna have to potentially identify public contributions from the city and the county. It's gonna have to identify grant opportunities to fund this work, like, right, you have certain funding sources that have to actually build something. You have funding for that are kind of exactly this, the research, so yes. I don't know.
Great.
Also, which entity is Jane, Jane contract and work and rate. So we're discussing.
That makes sense. Does everybody, I mean, it does seem like a valuable milestone. We're gonna need some money to do this. Kayla and I only have so much money. We'll give you a little bit. Okay. Is there an adjacent or related, like what would we need to identify this funding? If I'm, one of you guys, if I was in Gail's shoes or something, I have an idea of what this might be. You guys might want to come up with a budget, like an initial estimate of what these things might cost.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes under identify funding is creating a budget.
Initial budgeting.
Initial budgeting,
Probably brief.
and then also like
So let's break that down.
initial budgeting was already in the bank.
How much is it gonna cost?
So we can look at this, but so then you have another one, which is there's the budgetary side. What do we think the expenses for these are? And then another side is where are the potential sources for these?
That's what I was gonna bring up, right? I mean, it's in addition to, what is this gonna cost from but also what are the other funding sources? What are potential grants, et cetera.
Great. So I think we got that piece good enough for now. I'm gonna put this guy down here as sort of a line for the engagement work. I've left a gap here intentionally in order for all of us to understand the relationship between the constraints analysis or the constraint study and the feasibility analysis. Maybe you guys could help us. I don't really know what, I mean, I think you guys have said it. I'm just not remembering what it is.
Water, electric.
Transportation.
Yes.
Yeah, it's primarily infrastructure.
Okay, so it'll look at constraints as in terms of infrastructure. Will it look at sort of site or technical or geotechnical constraints, or do we feel like we have that updated now too?
Well, so I think we need to revisit all of that work. All tremendous work that's been done on the site. So Tom's talking about
Yeah, we're doing.
serving the community, and I'm talking about developing the community. So those are two different feasibility analyses that both need to happen before the scenario planning. There is a lot of work that's been done. Some of it needs to be updated. Some of it is probably still relevant. But just coming up with even just like a basic kind of cost per acre to develop the site is going to be a really important thing to go to the scenario planning, just to feed that information.
And so let's just make sure I'm not overcomplicating things, because I am adding constraints as a standalone milestone next to feasibility, but a completely rational, smarter than me person could definitely combine these into.
That's where I'm confused.
Cool.
I don't know the difference.
Yeah, I think the way that this is like a non-important difference. The way that I've sometimes heard, this is the kind of thing where you hear other people who actually do this stuff talk about it. The way I've always heard them talk about it is like, we first define the constraints, like what are the things that are limitations on the site, just so we can know. And then you're like, okay, this is what we're left over with. This is the box. Inside that box, what's feasible?
That's,
And you're
yeah.
taking the conditions of that place and saying, because all this is gone now, like in this case, I'm sort of talking about physical or geotechnical or whatever constraints, but you could also do that in terms of political constraints. So we know that we're not gonna be able to do something that is X scale, like nobody wants 3,000 new units. We tested that or whatever it was. We tested at 2,000, what was it, 2,000 units?
2,200.
Yeah, so 2,200 units. We may, want to retest that, but like for now, we were like, oh, we kind of tested that. That's at the upper limit. So, political feasibility, that's a constraint. Now here's a good point though. For the interest of clarity, we can definitely put constraints just underneath a feasibility analysis where the feasibility analysis is really helping us understand. And I feel badly for like wading into the semantical silliness of this. Totally fine for them to be combined. I have just seen people sort of break those out. First, you understand the constraints, and then you go into that and work with what's left over to do feasibility. But I think what I'm hearing you say, Tom, and I think it's most important that like the city and YBHA have like a clear sense. I think the world is going to be completely happy. Nobody in Steamboat Springs is going to get mad at us for not having those two as separate things. So if it makes sense to put those all under the bucket of feasibility analysis that's looking at constraints, but also looking at other questions of like financial feasibility within the places that are developable. So is it easier to just put it all under one bucket, probably?
I was gonna say, I would argue for two buckets, right? I mean, in the sense of one of the things that I think we're hearing is what are today's constraints, right? I mean, in the sense of if we want to do, to the extent that there is some thought about moving expeditiously, what are the constraints in today's world, right? So if we wanted to do something that wouldn't require any sort of addition of, let's just say, police or fire or anything like that, kind of understanding what that starting point is. So what are the constraints under which we're working today, which doesn't, understanding those in order to move, potentially to move forward. Does that make
I
sense?
think some of it's probably just a question of like, what's easier for you guys to explain to the community and to your staff? And I would go, I mean, honestly, I'm looking at you, Tom, because like, you're the one who's gonna be talking to the engineering staff and all this. And so if it's easier to put it under one bucket and say, yeah, part of our constraints or our feasibility analysis is gonna be understanding the constraints. And if it's, I look at, and I agree with you, Gail, and at the same time, the people are gonna have to be like communicating this to the doers probably can help us. They both work. I think it's getting at the same ideas.
What I'm not seeing here is, we have a needs analysis that actually is very good. And the needs analysis says, here's how many units we actually need. That encompasses a timeframe, and a lot of it is immediate, some of it's long term. We also have, that you brought up political constraints. From a growth perspective, the only number that I've seen that makes any sense for our community is a population of about 20,000, a little more than 20,000 people in that area. That's where the growth would take place. It's not 20,000 in that area. We're at 13,000 now. Another 7,000 somewhere. I'm not sure politically acceptable that is. And so how do you balance those two? I need people now. I need housing for people today. And how does that relate to what kind of growth can be anticipated? And when would it happen? And that obviously touches on all infrastructure.
But it's all limited by the constraints analysis. All that you're talking about is limited.
If today's constraints are different than tomorrow's constraints.
I know, but we want to build today, tomorrow.
I agree. That's where you get into the.
I think we're like in a chicken and the egg situation.
Yeah.
Because you can always expand your constraints. If you're saying like our current water system can only support X amount of units, you know how to do that. You build a new water, add a new, I'm not saying that you should do that or that we have the money to do that. But what I'm saying is the constraints can always change based on new investments.
They're time dependent.
They're time dependent. So I think it is a chicken and the egg. I agree with you both. I would say that in a purple under the analysis part, we have revisit like previous geotechnical. I think we just need to revisit previous needs study.
Well, and I was gonna ask you guys if those are the work of clarifying and defining needs broadly and specific to affordability. was a really important part of the DST, right? And I would say all of these things are interrelated. This is where it can get a little dynamic, exactly as you guys are seeing. Based on the weight of that conversation inside that work, I would say that is maybe, that's why I suddenly, when you guys started talking about this, I was like, I'm putting constraints with feasibility to put all that stuff in a bucket that's sort of like understanding the technical conditions and realities that are going to help us understand what's possible. And you're right, it's dynamic. So like, oh, if you have more money, what's possible changes. And then that is related to, but I think probably a different milestone than revisiting and confirming the question of, needs. And that was such a huge topic. You guys just spent a lot of money on it, and it's going to be something you're going to want to feed into your feasibility analysis, because you're going to want to say, like, of this, how much do we think we want to actually try to accomplish here? Like, what's a range of beginning points? But I'm going to suggest, based on, again, the time we spent in the DST, that it might be its own thing, and we go, in that same zone, though. Are people comfortable with that?
Just understanding need.
Yeah, and I think I would say it's sort of a fine shared agreement around housing needs. Or, go ahead. I'm not saying it well.
This one, I think, is one that overlaps here between feasibility analysis and defining shared priorities. That's defining a need statement that could go in that category as well.
Yeah, I think this group has to decide on what is the need in our community to a certain extent, right? Like we have this needs analysis that shows us how many units we need just to keep up with housing, and then or catch up and keep up. Like we have really in-depth analysis on what the need is for the community when it comes to housing. But this group has to decide like what are the priorities of that analysis? How much, as Kale said, of a bite we want to take out of that chunk?
Oh, that'll also be part of the scenario planning. I
Yeah,
would say that was one of the biggest pushbacks from the community that I was involved with, was that constant feeling under pressure that we are so far behind that we will never get caught up. And I don't think we need to sell that to the community. I think the community knows that we need housing. I just don't think they want to hear that we need 3,500 units or whatever it is in the needs analysis. And I'm not sure that's part of this process.
Well, I think part of this process is making, or at least discussing and thinking about what percentage of those needs we will end up serving. And then needs are not just, I'll call it vertical, they're also horizontal.
Right.
They are, what AMIs are we going to serve? Where is the most critical need? That's where you get into, what kind of mixed uses do we want to have out there? The complexities are substantial, but I think we're going to end up saying, here are the needs here's the percent of the needs that we can meet and the types of needs they are.
And Kale brought up a great point, which is that affordability was one of the priorities you guys talked about. And so maybe what this is, because I think you guys are right, that like maybe one way to sort of capture this point is, would it be helpful to define a milestone of an initial sort of range of sort of need and affordability ranges to help guide some of the work? Like, what's a range of what we're shooting for, or is that something that we actually want to have come out of some other part of the process? Because I think, Dave, you brought up, all of you guys brought up this point of like, this has been this moving target. I think it's been one of the most dynamic targets in the process so far, as like every time we started making some headway in a direction, we're like, well, how do we even know what we're trying to meet? What is the actual problem we're trying to solve? So I think some way of just sort of reconnecting to that point and trying to get to that, cross that bridge of, and that doesn't mean we have to define the entire regional need. It might just mean looking at our understanding of the regional need, trying to define a sort of a range of what are we looking at for affordability goals for. I don't know. I'm not saying it loud.
I honestly, I think.
I know. Yeah. I don't think I wrote it down well here. I didn't.
mean,
I said develop a statement of desired needs to meet. That's not right.
Should we call them affordability goals or?
Okay,
Yeah.
Affordability goals is good. I think I'd put attainable goals because I want us to separate from the definitions of affordability.
Fair point. So housing choices and,
Exactly.
define, goals for, housing choice and affordability or something like that.
If you look at the Riverview project, the whole business there is attainable. They don't have any line targets. This is just what does the local workforce afford or attain. If you look at some of the developments that are taking place today, that's why I talked to Calais. Because what she does is they're attainable housing. They don't put AMI limits on stuff. They don't do deed restrictions. They are, we want to have homes for locals that they can afford. So they're different kinds of homes. And that's, so it is a seriously complex dynamic.
Well, and I'm gonna, so Lou, when you say locals, I mean local workforce, I guess I'd like to make sure that we've got the caveat that we're.
Oh, I think it's local workforce. I mean, that was my intent. Well, if you want to talk about, retirees downsizing and stuff like that, I suppose that belongs in there as well.
So what if we, for the interest of moving forward, go ahead.
Just to clarify, the constraints analysis that we are doing, direction that we got from city council was to look at what the city could essentially assimilate with our current local services without adding significant staff or costs. That's it. So it's, what can we serve from water without adding anything and affecting the level of service? What can we add from traffic standpoint without significant infrastructure? What can we add from roads without adding, having to add streets? Wastewater. Those are fire, police. So, that's what's gonna come out of it.
Can I ask a question?
Here's-
Just a question on that.
Yeah.
Does that mean that the city is against any project that goes above and beyond that?
No, but I think that what we have heard is that to do anything above and beyond that in the immediate future requires significant infrastructure. And would be a lot more complicated to accomplish, particularly from a water standpoint.
But if this, addressing water and addressing these in our scenarios is part of the plan and identifying funding to help those infrastructure upgrades, or whatever that is, right? Like, obviously, this is much bigger than. But, if that was a part of the plan, is that something that the city would be open to investing in? And, Dave, Gail, Thomas, we want to for all of you, because I think that really helps guide this group's work. If the city is like, we are only supportive of a project that fits within our existing constraints, then we need to know that. If the city is, we are open to projects that go past our current constraints, we just need to figure out how to fund and what that looks like. I think that's an important differentiation for us moving forward.
We first talked about a phased approach, and I think what we're really talking about is the early phases of anything in a project like this are gonna have to work within the existing constraints.
Right.
So those
Right.
larger items, I mean,
Well, and I guess I haven't seen.
developing that infrastructure could take decades, just to be honest. It's not a turnkey type thing. So in the short term, middle, long term, I think that's kind of the big picture here. So I think it's really tough to say, does it mean you're not going to invest in it? Every community has to invest in that because also the standards change what you design to, like, it's just a constant infrastructure planning process, but what's the gap right now, which can be addressed? And then what's the gap midterm and further down?
I think
that's
to
what
answer your
we're,
question, the city council is open to that,
Right.
but not for the first phase.
But that's what you're driving, that, I think that's what this
great
is,
answer.
a fate.
I'm gonna interject. I mean, I'm not sure it's that hard of a line, Tom. I mean, I think, from my perspective, it's a baseline, right? It's understanding what the constraints are today so that we've got a baseline for decision making. So, this is my individual, my individual perspective. I don't know, Counselor Barnes, if you have a different perspective, but that's, when I'm looking at this, and I think what I've heard is that's the, that's the baseline. And, from the perspective of if we want to move forward faster, that gives us a framework from which to make that decision. But I don't think it's, to your point, Angelica, I don't think, we're saying that we're not open to moving. I don't know that we've had that conversation. I don't think there's a decision that says, no, we're not open. I think it's about understanding, right? And that's where this whole conversation about feasibility comes in, right?
That's helpful, and I think that is what you just said too, Tom, is super helpful, because I think that just helps guide our work to where you're like, if we want to get something done, then it has to fit within the current constraints, and we want to work within those limits, and I just think that that's really important for us to communicate throughout this, is as we develop the scenarios, like, we're looking at phases that fit with what we can do, like, we're not trying, anyway, yes, thank you, that's super great.
And this will get into, as I'm gonna go back to our key terms now. Well, we're gonna revisit tomorrow around the group's purpose. What you all are ultimately thinking about is what's in the like green bucket of what are we trying to accomplish together? Is this group setting out to figure out what is feasible now? Is this group creating a picture of short, middle, and long-term goals for you, which is kind of that larger end state that you're thinking towards, that determines, well, what do you do in these steps beforehand too?
In my mind, this is kind of like a proof of concept for the community. And that you can do a small phased approach to affordable housing and prove to the community what's in it for the rest of the community, not just for the folks that are going to be stakeholders to live there. In that sense that we are all going to move towards eventually developing the whole property. But the proof of concept phase is this first phase.
And I think this is probably something you guys are gonna have to look at, I think this is gonna be one of those things that, I can just feel like there's gonna be this back and forth between like, feeling like we're closing in, feeling like it's too wide. So basically, I think one of the things is really to come up to get to a point where you guys can have a phasing strategy. And it's going to need to be something that is informed by some of the pieces that are here. And so one of the things you guys might want to do is, rather than confirm to a certain scale now, acknowledge that the community's been clear. They want to understand they want a phased approach. My sense of talking to people in the community, going to the DST and everything is like, what that means is actually pretty variable. And so some of the work will require evaluating the sort of sensitivity of community on both sides. Because one of the things that happens is you go too small and you lose people. We lost in Glenwood, our mayor, who was one of the, very significant proponent of workforce housing, stopped becoming a proponent of a funding program for workforce housing because we weren't going big enough in his mind. Jonathan Goodis, I don't know if you know Jonathan. Well, anyway, he's running for county commissioner now. We'll chat.
Bad idea.
Good luck on that one.
Yeah, I told him, I was like,
There's a large upfront cost to just unlocking development at that site, and so
which could relate to feasibility.
exactly, that's an important consideration, just to.
So a phasing strategy might be a milestone we need to add, and we can add these components. I think what I went to, and this language could be better, but like, we need to confirm or begin to define some affordability targets and market segmentation, which is sort of more of a developer perspective on this of like, what's the part of the market we're trying to build for? And at this stage, it's not defined in a perfect development program way, where like it's X number of units meeting these income levels, X number of units of this type. But instead, I would imagine what you guys want is to at least gain some clarity around what do we mean when we say affordability? What do we mean when we say we want this sort of range of affordability levels? So that when we're going into the feasibility analysis, anybody who's doing that can be looking at the financial side of this with an eye for like, well, they're open to the idea that some of these things are market rate, or they're really wanting to include people at, below, 60% AMI, like just sort of trying to get some purchase on that. And another alternative you guys would have is to see what the feasibility analysis gives you and then refine that, which is why I kind of put that there might want to be some iteration between these. You could go into this with the sense of like, here's some things that we're wanting to test and hope that the feasibility analysis can give you more information of what's realistic. And then, all of it's going to come down to subsidy. Sure, you can, build way low if you want, but it's just going to require more subsidy. And hopefully your feasibility analysis would help give you some of that. Does that characterize it well enough, or am I confusing things?
I think that characterizes it well, and it makes me ask the question. When we talk about market rate housing. If you look like a lot of the workforce housing we have in our community today, it is market rate for the workforce community. Okay, there were no AMI limits on lots of the affordable housing, or attainable housing that exists out there. It's what the workforce market can buy. It defines the market. So the market's defined differently. If you want to say market rate housing for second homeowners, it's a very different story. And I don't know if that's a constraint. I don't know if that's something we deal with at this point in time in this discussion. Is that something that happens up front? I don't know.
And I think that's where that actually adds some definition to what if we think of this as something that go back and forth, to the degree that you guys have hard stops on any of these, where it's like, none shall pass. None shall pass. You might want to sort of do that there, where if you're like, this can't be X, like there shall be no castles or whatever it is. And then beyond that, you're sort of saying, so you're sort of defining box that you want the feasibility analysis to work within.
Well, I'm asking that question.
I know, and I'm saying, I don't think we're gonna nail it down today,
No,
and I'm placing you in here,
think so.
It might be helpful to, just the way I'm framing constraints is thinking them as, physical constraints, financial constraints, and political constraints. Like if you want kind of three high level sort of buckets, a lot can go in there.
What was your first one?
Physical?
Yeah.
The only one that I really wanted to put definition to that we didn't get to was I think there's probably a lot to unpack with the annexation agreement, but that's also, there's sort of like I think this is a pretty good place to get to as a development plan that we can sort of take in front of the community. So I was hoping we could put a little definition around this particular milestone. I have development program because you guys have been talking about it. So what's the right unit mix? What's the right use mix? What are the building types? If briefly we could add anything that's like, well, the development plan needs to have these things. You guys already did this, so you kind of know the elements of one. Is there anything that's an obvious, just in the interest, again, what we're trying to do here is like confirm these milestones, but also add definition to them so that our shared understanding of like what we're working towards is a little clearer. What are some of the other key elements of like a development plan that you guys would want to be able to move forward with the community?
I think that's a broader communication that or the conversation that we should have as to what are the city's expectations from be in a development plan. Is that kind of co-created at the same time as an annexation agreement? Or walking through some of the bigger kind of chapters of an annexation agreement and doing it at the same time that we're creating the plan. Like one thought that comes to mind is street sections, very technical, but the way that the city allows on-street parking, those are things that directly impact the development plan.
Yeah, I think they're co-created.
Yeah. And that would be a way that we do it differently than last time. That could be really.
Oh, it'll be, I think that's a lot of what you guys are building towards, the ability to get to that spot and do it with like we're all singing from the same sheet of music in terms of what is and isn't feasible, where the resources would be, so that we're not
in this space where the community is saying they don't have these things figured out. And so if we were to just sort of think at a high level of the typical components of that without getting perfect, but it's like, because you're right, like getting the level of street sections and do you guys gonna want a landscaping plan with tree, you know, all these things. But it's more like there's a development program side of it. There's probably there's kind of just a vision element, like, you know, being able to define what the overarching idea is. Then there's sort of site planning, you know, aerial looking down. We could decide whether you guys want to incorporate sort of the financial planning into the development plan, or if you want that to be its own component. But you know, those are sort of classical elements of it. When we do community plans with people or a downtown strategy or whatever, like, you know, there's the physical side, there's the programming. Sometimes you get into like a specific streets plan.
Personally, I think the phasing is going to be dictated by constraints from infrastructure. It's going to be how much can you afford as a community to build? And when can you afford it? You know, because if we're talking about here's today's constraints and, you know, how do you get past those constraints? Well, that dictates when phasing is going to take place. So this is, you know, you get back into, do you want to develop the whole site and say this is what it would look like? Or do you start with tiny little pieces? And I know that, you know, we're not there yet. That's phasing will ultimately drive whatever it is that we're going to sell this station. I believe.
Sounds like phasing should be a purple.
I was thinking, is it a pink one or a purple one? Because I could see it being both. Like, you need an overall strategy for phasing, like how big are we going first? Because is your development plan might be a first phase, or it might be the whole thing. So
that is the big deal. It's, you know, when you get into, should we have grocery store?
And I think there's two to go on a development plan. So I think you guys need to come up with like a phasing strategy overall for the whole site. And then depending on where you land with that, there'll be sort of inside. I mean, maybe this is like Russian doll, you know?
A general question for the group about this topic and conversation. And maybe I'm just talking out loud here and I'll answer it myself. But when I think of a development plan, one of the things about the previous like development plan and the annexation was like a lot of stuff was added to there that I think makes a good community, but that made the project more expensive. And I think this group probably needs to define what the priorities are for phase one. Is phase one to build a neighborhood and a community, or is it to just build housing? Like, those are some of the questions that I have when it comes to a development plan, like a 40-acre park and like all of the things that were thrown around. Like, we had law enforcement who wanted buildings there. We have one grocery store there. But like, is that a part of the development plan? Is that a part, you know what I mean? I think we need to kind of get clear, not today, but eventually, on what does it look like? Because rightly so, there's a lot of user groups who are going to say, we want to be in this neighborhood. We want a piece of the pie. And what is our goal here? Is our, you know, we want to build homes. I think, but is it, that's what I'm saying. Is it we want to build a neighborhood in phase one though? I'm asking about phase
I
one.
think go under define shared priorities, because it depends on like, is our priority building affordable housing right now as soon as possible, or is our priority building like a community neighborhood out there first?
That's what I'm saying is like, I agree we want to eventually have a neighborhood, but I don't think we can build a neighborhood in phase one. Correct me if I'm wrong, like phase one to have a full functioning neighborhood seems like a lot, like, you know what I mean? So I guess that's where I'm saying is like, that's what I would like to eventually nail down. Is phase one just the housing parts of the neighborhood, and then phase two, we're adding this, is phase one.
Yes, no, the phasing plan is really, it's going to drive.
You're getting at questions of scale and phasing, and they're interrelated. And just to carry some of the points you're making, I mean, at one point early on, we talked about whether we should sort of scale this thing out to like, maybe the easiest thing to do would be like a West Steamboat revisit of like how, because when you ask a single project to carry the water for all of those things, of course it becomes less feasible.
Yeah.
And in the absence of knowing where these other things are going to come from, of course people are going to say, well, if we're going to do that much, we're going to need this thing, so therefore we want that project to carry it. So you're kind of caught in between those two dueling perspectives, unless you say, here's how we're thinking about the phase and scale of the work that we're working on. And so, I don't know that we know exactly where this fits because it feels a little bit like another thing that'll iterate around the feasibility questions. But it feels like a sort of a strategy for what the phasing and scale that we're talking about would be really helpful before you guys start getting into a plan and a scenario analysis, because it might define what the lines you're working on are, you know? And I think you bring up a very interesting part of that scaling strategy, which is like the priorities will help, but just outlining priorities won't make the decision, because you're gonna be like, oh, well, of course we want affordability and we want it to be neighborhood and we want, okay, what's the job of this project to carry? Like, what are we expecting this project to fix or cover? Because if you want this project to sort of solve the West Steamboat transportation challenges, that's gonna be hard.
Yeah, and we don't have all the players in the room for that. You know, if we want this group to solve open space, if we want this group to like, to me, because we have these groups, it's like we're focused on housing, but I could be wrong and I'm happy to be wrong. I think the way that it's outlined is we have like the big development plan, which is for it to be a neighborhood, like the Slate Creek neighborhood. That is the vision. That would be wonderful. Grocery store, multi-use, like all these beautiful things you want to see out there. But what is the development plan for phase one? And what is the priorities for phase one? So yes, I like the way you outlined that.
Oh, that's interesting, Clark.
Did you? I don't hear.
I was thinking about this as define shared priorities.
I think it could go there. I mean, there's an interesting question. Yeah, I think it could go there, and then we're gonna want the vision. So she put together a developed vision statement for Slate Creek neighborhood, and then which would come under shared priorities. I like it. Yeah, that makes good sense.
I was gonna say, it's all how you define neighborhood. There's a whole bunch of, for me, I consider my little townhome complex my neighborhood, not the entire street. It's my neighborhood.
Yeah.
Those are the people you know and interact with every day, probably where you are too.
Yeah, Schuschmark is my neighborhood. My
Exactly.
street is my neighborhood.
There's
That's-
no other support services.
My neighborhood is not the super select in Oak Creek, which is the closest grocery store, right? Yeah, no, totally. My neighborhood is just the road I live on.
So here's a thing that I think we'll capture in the notes and like as we put this together is there's some very important interplay between the scale that we're working with, the phasing, like scale in general, and then the phasing is the sequencing of that. As it pertains to our ability to, you know, kind of meet these affordability targets and what's, well, I guess what I'm saying is there's an interplay between these four things. Like we have to ask ourselves questions about what are we trying to meet from a kind of market and affordability perspective. How does that needs to feed into some of our thinking around feasibility analysis, and it will also be informed by the feasibility analysis. Similarly, the feasibility analysis is going to give us a better sense of like what are we really talking about in terms of developable land and like scale of cost, so that we can have a more informed discussion around this. And then all of these are going to help feed into the scenarios. And it's possible too that to the degree there is gray area still to be worked out, that can be worked out in scenarios. We can have a scenario that's like a slightly larger scale scenario. And again, what we use the scenarios for is to learn. And so people are like, oh, I love all the elements of this, but I think this one's too small. I think it'd be better if it was scaled out a little bit more or what have you. So that's how we get to that preferred one. So I just want to acknowledge that there's, to some degree, it's hard to have perfect linearity along these things, even though it's nice to see how they lay out in sequence. I want to confirm that that feels all right, and we'll capture it as best we can in the report out from this. But I do think in terms of like defining what this, like you guys are getting into the meat of the planning work really, which is good. Does that feel okay? Is anybody who's sitting here being like, oof, this is really giving me heartache because I see it totally differently than that? Okay. We got a couple more elements here for some engagement and just, I think there's some of us who are doing planning work. We got some recovering planners. I know that we can put more meat on these bones as we get to it. Where we didn't get to is sort of defining out the elements of all of this. But I think to some degree, the amount of detail we have here
gives us probably what we need to work with for now in terms of the ability to work internally and also communicate where we're trying to go to the community.
Well, we.
And begin thinking about,
it out.
I thought, isn't it, oh, it's 4. I thought it was 5. I felt so bad. Oh my God.
30 minutes.
I've been so worried. I've been like, oh my gosh. We're 20 minutes late. You guys have been so gracious with your time.
You can't keep up with the flexible boundaries.
I can't tell you how nervous I've been. I keep looking at the clock, like, I can't believe they're so chill. It's 25 minutes over.
James, I ask you a question, oh, sorry, just on the annexations side. Because like things are gonna evolve over the course of whatever this is gonna be, 12 months or 18 months, both with the economy and also with the other, sort of affordable housing that's gonna be coming online through our gracious builder in town. And so all these AMIs and all these things, I mean, you guys are gonna learn what sells in cottonwoods over time and what's in demand and what's not, and those things. So for us to try to define all that prior to like putting together an annexation vote or a proposal for annexation, are we going too far down the rabbit hole to get all that stuff defined for the annexation vote? Or does all that need to have to happen prior?
Putting in what you want, basically, is the big answer on the annexation agreement, but you could have the details in the first phase and more of a broader master plan for the future phases as part of an annexation vote that, or you could phase your annexation agreement over time too. So you've got a lot of flexibility in how you structure that. The public, I think, wants more details, but we'll probably only have the details for the first phase, right? So.
Yeah, that's the question of whether we annex the whole property.
Yeah.
Whether we only annex that first phase, however big that is, and just leave the rest of the county.
Yeah.
Or in our communities, it will annex a big piece of property. Boulder did it many years ago, and they just put a sort of a holding zoning.
Yeah.
That's in fact open space, but designated for future development. And it just sits there. Nobody can develop, it doesn't have any zoning to it. I think that's the decision.
Yeah, I mean, there's some flexibility on how to approach that. It's the one element of municipal government there, you have a lot of flexibility.
And that is develop an annexation strategy. Phased or singular annexation would be one step in that process.
Because that may allow us to work backwards with less detail. And more broader scenarios for the community to look at.
I mean, one of them is track the fact that the original Rock Ranch was phased. First phase was 1,100 units. I mean, that's the community development plan, that's what's that. Now, it failed for a lot of reasons, but it was a phased program. So should we have 1,100 unit development, annex that amount of property, whatever that's associated with phase one? Not said it was 2,200 units. That's, somewhere in there, we have to have that conversation.
I mean, I disagree. I don't think you do. Phase one, you take your constraints analysis and you figure out what you can't build. And that's what we propose to.
I
And we don't talk about the other phase. We don't scare them.
That's phase one. That's phase one. And then is that what the annexation's about? Because that's what people vote for. See, I mean, Jen was talking about,
You could park the rest of the property like Tom mentioned, there's a bunch of options on how to approach that.
Right.
Yeah. And there's no perfect option.
oh, no, we've learned that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you look at all of this and we have all these things like engage community and, get their direction, it really comes down to how you actually do that and how effective you are. And is it the loudest voices or is it,
You don't have to convince the entire community.
Right.
I mean,
What is-
reality. We're never gonna make everybody happy about it.
Oh, no, we're not making everybody.
Well, and I think if you look back at the analysis that we did and some of the other work, it can become really easy to oversimplify the community and political dynamic. A lot of
where at least from the analysis we did, dynamics were there were some components where just people felt like certain, this was too much, that was, things weren't getting right. Huge proportion though of, or not, a meaningful proportion of your opposition were less concerned about those questions and more concerned about the questions that weren't being answered in general. Like, how is this actually gonna work? Like, how do we actually have the money?
Right.
Is this going to like actually pan out? And so I think sometimes in these dialogues, I worry that we need to be careful not to overstate our understanding of the public's tolerance for things that we actually have very little understanding of, because they didn't even really get to that point because the frustration around these gaps that they saw, they being overly generalized term for the community, because some of the community didn't see, but there were these questions around like, who's going to carry the water and paying for this? Are we going to get saddled for that? Are there really these things that haven't been figured out? Is that project that we saw in Vision looks cool, like actually gonna fit on that site, and how? What is it good? So those were things in addition to concerns about density and scale and it's too big or not too big that were there, but it was more than just a question of it's too big or too little. It was much more than that. Just one reason too why we've been encouraging in the beginning, I would encourage you guys not to talk about unit numbers or anything like that for a while, because it just hems you in. Once you start saying it's a project of this size, at this scale, you totally hem yourselves in. And the reality is, from an urban design perspective, you can make a really crappy 200 unit project that looks horrible and feels like the type of stuff that nobody wants. You can build beautiful, 2,000 unit neighborhood that feels like, something out of, I don't know. So we overthink numbers as an analytical tool for what something's going to look like, where there's a lot of design work to do. So I hope I'm not trying to overstate my position on these things as much as it from our experience, backing yourselves into a place of understanding numbers right now probably will help, because that's why you have to do all this work.
Understood all the constraints analysis is going to establish numbers.
No,
And that's just like how many units you.
And that will happen.
Big
Or a
water perspective, yes.
Or a number max, right? We'll determine kind of a number max, because what if the constraints analysis comes back and says you can build 1,000 units there, but then this group is like, we only want to build 500,
I think
right?
it's probably gonna be the opposite.
No, I agree, yeah. I'm not.
And also it's probably based on
But it-
this,
we'll
and again,
determine
to your
max,
point,
right?
then it's a question of, well, can you change the lever on? What are the hard constraints that are unchangeable, and what are the things that are constraints where somebody would say, well, if you have money, you could do X, you can, right?
Yeah, but you're
So
also,
I want to pull us back for just a second, because we're starting to get into the conversations about the actual planning itself. And with the time that we've got left for today, there are still some gaps on our roadmap, and I want to make sure we fill these in. And then we can get going on the roadmap itself. But I want to take just a moment, with the time we've got left. You've got the purple sheets in front of you. Take a look at the questions up here. In particular, we haven't really built out defined shared priorities, annexation agreement, or vote. Or if there's anything else in here that's missing, take a moment to just reflect for yourself for a second and write down any purple items that you see missing that we need to add up here. And then we can keep adding them in.
Are you saying?
Milestones.
Yeah. Kind of, and the purple being these like sub milestones.
These were sort of, again, it's just a tentative brainstorm of things that, when I was looking at it, I was like, probably going to need these things. And we've gotten to a bunch of them, right? We talked about a phasing strategy. We've clarified the question of constraints. We haven't sort of defined a point at which we want to initiate this process. And maybe that's more of an engagement milestone. Anyway, I'll let you guys think about it.
And I would just say, to set expectations, it's probably more define constraints than it is agree on constraints.
Sure. Well stated.
The constraints are going to be what they are.
I'm gonna have us switch modes for just a second, because talking out prioritizes microwaves, and I want to prioritize slow cookers for a second. To just have a quiet moment to think through what's missing from this and write down any other ideas you've got.
We're ready for fuller pink.
You could do either. If you've got a major milestone you think is missing, I can give you a pink.
Okay.
If you've got something that's a sub item that we need to include, do a purple.
The things are kind of now big umbrellas under which other things can fit. And if you're not sure, write it down and we'll work together to figure it out. There are some hints up on the slides.
This doesn't, talk enough about how to have a process. That might be something that if you wanted that earlier on, you put in a step of identify developers to be part of decision-making processes to add in here. If you want to add it to a purple sheet, that's perfect.
To the degree you find, and tell me if this is fair, but I think it's also true that if there are sort of engagement specific milestones you want to add, you can put those in yellow.
Under annexation agreement, Gail.
Nice job, Gail. Good.
Go Gail. I'm trying to understand this. You said elect Oscar the Grouch for governance chair. Trying to see if you can, it says components of agreement. Great.
People have a good sense of theirs. Let's just go around and Tom, will start with you this time. Do you want to put yours up there? And
Well, mine's one, but it's probably goes in three different locations. You know. It's gonna define role.
It's interesting that there's these kind of elements that are somewhere between process, like there's a decision-making element.
Well, someone, I mean, if we're hiring experts or we're hiring somebody to do the scenarios, somebody's got to manage that consultant.
Mhm.
Who's doing that?
And manage the like there's a whole process management element to this. I'm wondering if a new color would be useful. Because that is a little different than process, because you're right, some of it's, in some cases, I would be process oriented, in some cases it's more, other pieces. You said it's not this group overall. I mean, it might be that this group is making the decisions on who and what roles and responsibilities, but isn't necessarily doing it all. And that, I think that was what you were saying.
Exactly.
It's not this group that's going to do it all, but this group might actually be who's defining those points at different stages.
Yeah, at some point, we're gonna have to find somebody who has capacity to manage this.
Exactly.
So that thinks what is probably, go ahead.
I think that actually fits into what we're doing in this process of it could be a step in this that we need to, as part of our governance, figure out the roadmap and who's in charge of which pieces.
Yeah, and that's why I
Yeah.
didn't know where to put it.
Yeah.
Define roles and responsibilities, because I do think it's probably divvied up.
And then we can add a milestone, and I've been wondering about this, if you want it's captured in that point of the roadmap to some degree. And yet there's maybe a layer down from that, which is like basically scope. Define a scope of work and process design for all of this. Because if we were to take that roadmap and then turn it into something that has more defined scope items. And one of them, as an example, like you guys are gonna have to do a process design. Somebody's gonna have to sit down and design. We can talk about what we want it to look like. We're gonna have to design it. Another element is, yes, we're gonna have to lead the scenario planning work. Some of that's process, some of it's technical.
Yeah.
And so I think we could probably plop that somewhere into sort of a developing, I don't know, is a scope of work the right thing to put forward? It's multiple scopes of work, probably.
It's multiple, I mean, community engagement is one too, we'll probably have another.
Yeah.
So.
I don't want to cut in line, but I had the same, like, this is what, I think you summarized what I meant by this. So mine was like, clear leadership on these things, like who's leading each milestone, who's managing it. So
Let's just make.
I don't want to like cut you guys, who were next, but just you summarize. Yeah.
You want Okay, so this is actually a pre sort of thing, but I'm just gonna cluster these sort of like governance pieces here. Knowing they actually come here, but rather than move everything. Okay. Let's go to Dave. What did you want to add?
Two things, and kind of the question I had led into with Jay about how much detail we need in the annexation agreement was, when we put the development, will we ever consider putting the development plan after the annexation agreement? So you're more broad to the community with the annexation, sort of just the absolute numbers of what it's gonna be rather than the whole design of the property. I'm just throwing it out there because I don't know if you need that much minutia to go to get it to vote if it's a small enough project. I'm positive if that's the right way, just asking, will we consider trying to put less effort into all the detail to get it to the vote? Or do we think we need all that detail to get it past the vote?
One of the complaints, I guess, associated with the initial project was lack of definitions. I didn't feel there was enough definition for the
Would be
plan.
totally different from 300 units to 2,400 units.
I mean, see, now you start jumping into here's how many units we're making.
More.
And how many annexations would be. I mean, to me, that's the other question that's out there.
But I'm gonna capture what you're saying, Dave, as this is a terrible version of these
Here's
errors.
the least complicated process to get to the point where we could have a development way and.
You're asking if those two things could be flipped here. this piece. And then did you have another purple one?
Just sort of a developer engagement early on for basic feasibility, just even if the ideas we're throwing around are actually feasible, regardless of the constraints analysis. But just getting some sort of guidance from somebody who's in the business, says, you know, that's not gonna work, it's not gonna work there.
Okay.
So Dave, are you suggesting almost like a peer review of like the sort of the scenario planning? That we would need, like we would need, a developer or a developer consultant to do that, to guide the feasibility analysis, the phasing, or excuse me, not the phasing, the scenario planning. So
Yeah.
are you suggesting that we have like kind of a third party sort of
And then,
test of that from a different developer or a group of developers?
There's somebody from the development community that sort of understands how the whole process is gonna play out. Whether or not, well, you know, if we say we want to entitle 22 acres, it's down by the road for commercial, well, that's not gonna be, you know, that's gonna be entitled, but it's not gonna be part of the development. How, you know, what does that feasibility look like? And then putting, you know, 200 or 300 house development in, is that feasible from day one, from a development standpoint, or are we just, you know, money's not gonna fall that way, you know, they would know more of those logistics and the combined logistics of all those things.
So I want to make sure we get Gail in because I'm saying, that's what she's talking about. So she's talking about a developer advisory committee.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so the reason so that's why I want to confirm. You said a group, I think it is important at this stage to like, you guys add some dynamics in your last process and even the in between with this. When you bring in like a perspective from a developer, it can be pretty helpful and create a lot more internal accountability than expertise if you have multiple perspectives on it. Because the reality is that different developers have different models and different approaches. These things, there's certain things that are like hard and fast, and there's other things that are like, well, we actually see that differently. We'd approach it this way, and we think under those things. So that would be helpful. And also just what you don't do then is place both the burden and power in like the single hand of an individual person. I mean, you had some experience with this. Gail, I want to create clarity around your comment, developer advisory committee. Oh, there it is, developer, not developed advisory committee, developed. Thanks.
And I put it up as yellow, just as anything where we're establishing like a group.
A group, great. And that could be then a group that helps us in different stages, right? Awesome, okay.
And that was my point, I think, Clark, is what you just made is right. I mean, it's, let's, you know, get a brain trust in terms of various different perspectives and use it to kind of truth test what we're doing, but also, right, have you thought about this? These are different ideas. These are different approaches. So not just one, but multiple.
And Gail, I think I'm gonna put this in an overlapping way because I think part of it being talked about in context of process.
Yeah.
And in the context of decision-making for this group. So I think now we got to capture both thoughts. Great, okay.
Okay, so we've got, I want to try and just get everybody's out on the table, knowing that then we'll keep revising this. But we've got 7 minutes left and 5 more people, so we're just gonna do a quick roundabout. Shannon, what would you add?
I wrote public forums, but I'm wondering if that's too specific. So I changed it to engage community for feedback before vote following development plan / annexation agreement in case like our scenarios that we developed or the development plan we created for the scenarios was like way off of like what people meant.
Okay.
All really nice writing.
Oh, thank you. Very kind.
Look, Dave, it's not you, buddy. Have you looked at my writing? Have you seen how the spelling's bad and the language? Anyway. All right, keep going.
I just put down partners because there's all these other entities who are looking both private and publicly for housing needs. And we had the school district right around the corner just recently within the county looking at a 2022 unit project. And maybe there's more synergy working with other groups who could bring resources and we could have a lower price point. Ski Company, for example, I think they were 200 beds short in their article today. So what my partners and my penmanship sucks, so please no comments.
Well, at least you wrote it really big.
Yeah. But like, who's out there who we engage early on as partners in the project who have housing needs, but can also bring capital to it, because we're gonna be constrained.
This is, I see Clark waffling between these two categories. Is this that you want to engage them in identifying funding and for key milestones, or do you want them to be part of the decision-making process?
You're talking about like in the development potentially.
Yeah, I think, yeah. But I think that could morph to different spots, like,
So that's why I put it here. Like, I think the reason I put it here is because this feels like an ongoing piece of develop. I mean, I have it up here as development partnerships, but it's a little different. Like, there's a term development partnership. Who we're going to work with to develop this. Another way to look at it is who could invest because they want. There might be local businesses, like you mentioned, the school district. The interviews we did leading up to what would become the DST. One of the most interested groups of people who were wanting more involvement in the last effort was those types of entities. We're like, we would have loved to have actually been part of the development partnership. And maybe that was something that was going to happen down the road, but they were interested in being involved. So
Yeah, I mean, that was, the Michaels organization was hired as
a master developer.
master, right? And they would have developers developing on the vertical aspects of the program.
All right, and Hanka, you're up.
I don't actually have anything else. The only last one I had was bring on development experts and we've covered that.
Great. Okay, Emily.
I have prioritized sub-elements within the vision statement, just acknowledging that the vision can be really grandiose and things are gonna get hard, but you have to be able to prioritize within that vision.
Okay.
I have revisit non-residential community needs. We did a lot of engagement around that the first go. We should revisit it as part of I put it under affordability targets and market segmentation, but then broaden that.
And on this one, we have a couple of things as we keep refining this. I want to pull out that we have explicitly named revisit different things, right? Which would be different from conduct new assessment or something like that. And so that's one area that as we revise, I want to make sure we're in alignment about whether or not we're contracting new studies or whether or not we're using existing and maybe adding to them and things like that. Sorry, go ahead.
Good point. I put zoning up here as a thing that we need to do.
It's not.
Where would you put it in the?
Like between development plan and annexation agreement, or it could be part of it.
You could do a milestone policy alignment.
And then detailed funding strategy. Or it's either its own thing or part of the annexation or the plan. Annexation agreement is both.
Yeah, actually, I'm thinking
Should it be something?
it is its own thing, because it'll drive everything, basic. It'll drive all kinds of deals.
I think one of the things we learned or seen since the last few affordable development projects that we've done, see is that having a developer, especially one that's involved in the capital stack and has, the feet tied to it. It's paramount to getting things done, but also the business process. When things change at AMI levels and that, but so having that developer, you find that developer that has those that set of sub skills as well, to be able to bring the financing along with them.
Well, and that's, actually financing was the big deal for me. But, we'll go after LIHTC funding, that's a different animal than building houses, or it's a different animal than, hiring or partnering with a developer, like the PG guys. Then they rent it and they have it. So that's part of the funding strategy, detailed funding strategy, I think. I did write down possible scenarios for sale versus rental strategies. Maybe that's part of the needs assessment.
Sorry.
For sale versus rental properties. That impacts economics dramatically. If I've got a rental property that's gonna give me 20 years worth of revenue. I can afford to do things differently and maybe afford more if it's rental.
The development program.
No, it is, but I think it's important because it is part of that whole funding strategy. You know, it's easier to get people to own a rental property. You know, that's why I think Riverside is all rentals. That's, you've got a 20-year revenue stream.
So we can put it with, potentially with this development program
Yeah.
as it's something specifically we need to build out.
Yeah.
And then once.
That one's, it's my own little bugaboo about, you know, funding will be important. Can we leverage the property itself to help fund it? And I don't know how.
I actually don't think that's a little bugaboo.
Okay.
I think that's a central question in this.
It gets a little bit too at the question of like other local partners. I mean, right now what we've got is milestone, you know, some of this will iron out. Is what we're gonna do is like take all this, try to sort of clean it up, not in like a sanitizing way, but just like, okay, let's make sure anything that's sort of, hangnails or anything, we'll make sure they're clear. But we have the same detailed funding strategy, development strategy and partnerships. These, again, I think it's interesting because they kind of circle in this zone of like getting some of the things right to pull this off. And that's why there's sort of the iteration between, and I think there is going to need to be these conversations. To be clear, I think we all have to recognize that like the nonlinear nature of some of these things, like some of these conversations are actually probably going to begin all the way back.
Yes.
Here, when we start asking questions of like, well, if we were to bring in X, if it was to be a larger proportion of market rate, then it changes these dynamics. And then what we're going to go through is a process to really engage the community in understanding like what do we want to see on the ground. And we have enough information now to be realistic in terms of what could be produced with the constraints that we have to work with, and get people's feedback and work towards something that we was a preferred scenario. But then all of those things are gonna have to be tightened down to like, okay, well, this is where we landed. Now we actually have to sort of go ahead and like completely fasten the screws on these things around like, all right, what's the actual development strategy and partnership? Where's the funding gonna come from? What are the different ways we leverage property? Again, we're gonna have to get zoning right. So does that make sense to people? It makes sense to me, but I want to make sure it makes sense to you guys.
Well, I think that this is enough for today. We're at time, so we're gonna come back tomorrow and we're gonna switch gears a little bit into talking about our group purpose that connects to the green, but we're gonna fine tune of like, this is all leading to blank so that we can collectively say SC squared is here to do X, and here's the steps we're gonna take to do it. And then we're gonna dive into community engagement. Okay.
This is good stuff. Can I mention one little thing and everybody can correct me? I believe that door locks at 5 o'clock. So just please make sure you take what you need, because you may have trouble getting back in this building and try to read.
Yeah, you cannot.
Yeah, so. And even though we're in this room tomorrow, I would take your stuff. I can't guarantee what a cleaning crew is gonna do any of that stuff, so I wouldn't. Back up, and come back tomorrow.
For just for group clarification too, or for my own, so I'm solo dad mode right now because my wife's out of town, and so I will be a little bit late tomorrow morning. I'll be here, but I'll be a few minutes late, you guys.
So no party.
Was that?
No party.
Heck yeah, my wife's gone. I got a 9-year-old that's extremely crazy. I gotta manage. So
Awesome.
he is a party all the time.
Awesome. So with that, everybody online, we're gonna go ahead and close things down. Thank
Thanks,
you,
Gail.
Gail. We'll see you in the morning or whatever time that is for you.
All right, have a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail.
Where's Gail? Where's?
Belize.
Oh, Belize.